Hello and welcome to the Nauticast podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast going through a Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week. I'm one of your hosts, Jeff, better known as Britta B. Fish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to the 138th episode of the Nauticast titled Battle Hymn. Actually, I'll do it one more time. It's the 139th episode, right? If I'm not mistaken.
It is the 138th.
Is it?
I believe so.
Right. One more time.
Catalan 7 and Catalan 7 Part 2 were 135 and 136. Theon 5 is 137, and this is 138.
Brilliant. All right. And welcome to the 138th episode of the Nauticast titled Battle Hymn, an analysis of A Clash of Kings Sansa 5, in which Sansa sings for mercy, yay, and has to talk to Joffrey and Cersei, boo, as the Battle of the Blackwater begins.
You know, even on the brink of the destruction of their entire house, the Lannisters just can't seem to leave Sansa alone. When will they learn? The answer is never.
Never, ever, ever indeed. As always, this episode is brought to you by our not a small council, our Hand of the King Wolfman Zach, Grand Maester Timbob, troubleshooter of systems and designer of circuit boards, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard Mark N, Lord Travis, master of ships and ward of the waves, captain of the war galley Nightwolf, the ship that stalks the seven seas, and wielder of the Valyrian steel trident summoner, the blade that brings the deep ones, Sir Keith J, master of whispers, Lord Philip the Merciful, master of laws, Archmaester June, healer of the Lesser Poxes, Ragged Michael, War of the North, Nelson Hammer, Prince of Dragonscone, Scarlet, the other woman, and Mistress of Whispers, Lord Micah, the Quilled Lion, War of the West, Herald the Golden Tooth, Master of the Banefort, and the Kraken's Bane, Lord James, the Gem that was promised, the High-Bearded Priest, Lord Jake Assistant to the Head of the King, Lazy of Valyrian, Sir Jack, Lord of Sir Arthur Dane, and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, Sad Prophecy Boys Club, His Grace's High Inquisitor, Sir Frank B., Sir Jasper the Cruel, the King's Justice, Lawrence, Prince of Dorne, Kelly, War of the East Mistress of Old Bay of Crabs, Stephen the Steadfast, Master of Hounds, the Blue Winter Rose, Knight of Highgarden, Lady Stephanie, Lord Adamus, Lord Carlos, Lord Andrew the Restless, a priest of the drowned god, the King's Cook, Noli Oli, Master of Cannoli, Sir Sorcedelica, Low Energy Dent, True Master of the Banefort, and True Master of Coin, Lord Penchant for Nostalgia, Queer Alex, Beyonce's Favorite Sin, Ambassador Chromatica, Rainbow Commander of the D's and Gentle Thems, Holdover, the Wait for T-Wow, A.A. Ron, Dampere, Prophet of the Forsaken, and High Priest of Euron Crow's Eye, Lieutenant Glenn, Lord of H-Town, Veneris, House Colgarian, the first of her name, Princess of Dragonstone, Mistress of Art, the Warwick, Queen of the Pencils, the Eraser, the First Draft, the Monochrome, Devotee, the Great Game of Thrones, Portraits of the Realm, Lady Reels of the Seven Kingdoms, Blood of Paints, Maker of Drawings, and the Michelangelo of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Lord Adam T., Lady Alexander of Tarth, Sir Christoph Logos, Bloody Scorpion of the Redfield, Defender of the Letter of Kin, and the Wolverine of House Corgoyle, Lady Elizabeth, Mistress of Horse-Faced Lesbians, Sir Josh Snow, Bastard Bounty Hunter of the North, Surveyor, Chief of Parties in the Frozen Wastes, Lord Peter, Lady Ashley, the Dead Shepherd Reborn, Preacher of the Poor Fellows, Marshal Harrison, Absent Shipwrecked in the Jade Sea, Grave Rob Stark, the Cadaver King and Horror of Harrenhal, Olaf, proponent of establishing a feudal, pseudo-democratic system of great councils wherein every count votes, Sir Tim, the Knight who was guided by voices, Lord Nick, Thucydides, Lord of Plagues, Sir Jack, Lord of Sir Arthur Dane, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, Sad Prophecy Boys Club, Lord Jean the Splendid, Master of Coin, Ward of Tampa Bay, Lady Anna, the Lovely Castellan, Pat Ironwood, the Blood Royal and Guardian of the Bone Way, Lord Charles Tyrell of House of Highgarden, Lord Paramount the Mander, Defender of the Marshes, High Marshal of the Reach, War of the South, and the Heir of House Tyrell, Luke, Lord of Lone Leaf and the Pillar of Autumn, Squid Pro Quo, Master of Zorse, Joe Snow, King of the Metro North and Protector of the Tri-State, Hedrigal, Captain of the Airship Arrogance, Squire Matt S., Future Matt S., the one who'll bring balance to the kingdoms, B-Word, Queen Beyond the Wall, Lord Kyle, Lord Samuel Seaworth, Sir Max, Lord Commander of the Constitutional Guard, Blackberry the Bold, Shape of the Field, Good Times, and Lady Ivory Dane, aspiring noble author in the Seven Kingdoms, Lady of Starfall, War of the South, and the patron of free-wheeling lesbians. Thank you to all of our small counselors.
Thank you, counselors, as always.
And our spoiler wing, as we say in every episode, we'll potentially be talking about all published books. That is the 5 novels, 3 detective novellas, histories, interviews, the Windsor separate chapters, as well as Game of Thrones, the TV show. Anything and everything.
Our question this week comes from Sir Keith J., our small council master of whispers, who asks, "Howdy guys, got a question for you two to chew on since we are approaching the end of Clash. At one point, the both of you discussed your feelings on the first book as politics being at the forefront, while magic and the supernatural were reawakening into the Song of Ice and Fire universe, but largely still in the background of the book's narrative for the most part. A few episodes ago, if my memory serves correct, Emmett mentioned Clash being the book where politics and magic intersect. So my question is this, given the way you framed the first 2 books, what is then your opinion on Storm? That's a great question. What do you think, Jeff? What is a Storm of Swords about if you took like the 10,000 foot view?
So mostly, from what I understand, it's a storm, and there are swords involved in said storm. So I'm imagining like a lightning
Bold take.
storm,
Okay.
and instead of like lightning flashing down, it's sword lightning. Get it? Sword lightning. It won't maybe not won't electrify you, but it'll still stab you. That's what I think a Storm of Swords is about. I could be wrong. It's been a few years since I've read the book, so maybe I need to reread the book. But no, I'm teasing, obviously. It's interesting. When I was considering this question, I thought about this in terms of um, the impression I get from Storm of Swords about like the magic and the politics denomination is that it kind of like goes back a little bit to a Game of Thrones um, where we have magic kind of like taking a back seat. So here in Clash, we've got like the wildfire, you've got the House of the Undying, you've got the others, you've got all these things which are very much where magic is at the forefront. And of course, you got Jojen and Mira and all these magical characters, Melisandre as well. And all those things do exist in A Storm of Swords, but they kind of like take a back seat a little bit. And the magic picks back up in A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. But then also, much like a Game of Thrones, you also have the others, which are showing back up. And of course, in the prologue to A Storm of Swords, in Chet's horrific prologue, not horrific, but in terms of badly written, but just in terms of who Chet is as a person, they show up immediately at the end of that chapter. And then you have Samuel's first chapter, and then Samuel 2 and 3, where he's encountering the rebellion of the Night's Watch, and then Samuel 3, where he's encountering all the whites at the abandoned village. Like that to me like has kind of a Game of Thrones, like a Game of Thrones type feel. But I don't know. I might be like a little bit out of my league, and this is one of those places where I've just started to get into like rereading A Storm of Swords as we're getting into at the end of A Clash of Kings, because a lot of the events from the end of this chapter, and not just this chapter, but a lot of the events from the ends of these chapters all spill over into Storm of Swords. So I'm starting to read into early to Storm of Swords. So maybe I need to have my take refreshed. And that's why I have you, sir, to tell me why I am wrong about this particular question.
No, not at all. I think, Clash, I think, feels like the magic is bigger just because it's more new in Clash of Kings, and George is having characters talk very explicitly and repeatedly about it, like especially in the Carthene chapters where just people are just talking about it constantly. A Storm of Swords does have those elements still with Beric and Thoros, with the others, with all the, weirdness Melisandre's up to behind the scenes. Obviously, I think stuff like the Red Wedding gets a lot of attention. I think what links the two for me, that like A Clash of Kings is about everything getting really complicated in both the political and magical realms. And A Storm of Swords, I think, is about attempts to resolve those complications. Like, I think that's the broadest possible way to put it. Like, that defines, like, Dany liberating the slaves, but also the Red Wedding. Mance trying to free his people, but also the White Walkers trying to kill everybody. Like, A Storm of Swords is about people going, okay, screw it. Everything that got built up in A Clash of Kings, let's try to cut through all of that.
Yeah.
And get something new, whether it's politically or magically. And I think that's why A Storm of Swords is so beloved, because it is so viscerally, like, it's cathartic. It's characters trying to seize control of the narrative and do something different with it. Whereas, I get why people in A Feast for Crows, where people are just going, ugh, everything's awful. Like, that's most of A Feast for Crows. I love that, but I get why some people don't necessarily.
Well, I was thinking about this as well. Like, the Storm of Swords opens with the others attacking the Fist of the First Men, the Great Magical Act, and it concludes the epilogue to A Storm of Swords is the reveal of Lady Stoneheart as reborn or undead Catelyn Stark. So I think George wants the focus primarily to be on the politics in A Storm of Swords, but much like a Game of Thrones, he's like, hey, listen, magic still is out there, and like it will fuck you up. So be on the lookout for that, because it is coming for you really hard. Come A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, and especially when we get it to the Winds of Winter.
So thank you so much to Keith for the question. If you'd like to ask us questions, we answer here on the Not-A-Cast podcast. You're welcome to become a Sworn Sword or higher level patron over at patreon.com/Not-A-Cast ASOIAF, where you can get show notes, bonus episodes, merch, access to the Not-A Slack, and all those shout outs you hear at the start and end of every episode, and more.
Yeah, and as our periodic reminder, we are actually pretty close at this point to actually achieving that goal, our next Patreon stretch goal. And when we get there, we will do a full multi-part analysis of the first Dunk and Egg novella, The Hedge Knight. So if you might be interested in us sinking our literary jaws into Dunk the Lug, consider supporting us, 2 hunks, on Patreon at patreon.com/Not-A-Cast ASOIAF. But enough about Patreon. When we last checked in with Sansa Stark, she had witnessed the opening moves on the Battle of the Blackwater, had a fun chit-chat with Dantos Hollard and an even more fun chit-chat with Senator Clegane. And then she had her first period before being hauled in front of Cersei Lannister for another super cheery chat. Let's find out how Sansa's doing just before the war and the Bay erupt in this synopsis of A Clash of Kings, Sansa 5. They had been singing in the sept all morning since the first report of enemy sails had reached the castle. The sounds of their voices mingled with the whicker of horses, the clank of steel, and the groaning hinges of the great bronze gates to make a strange and fearful music. In the sept, they sing for the mother's mercy. Out on the walls is the warrior they pray to, and all in silence. Sansa remembered how Septim Mordane used to tell him that the warrior and the mother were only two faces to the same great God. But if there is only one, whose prayers will be heard? These are excellent and very existential questions that Sansa is posing to the gods at the open of this chapter. But beyond that, baby, we are here. It is Blackwater time, and this train ain't stopping for 6 glorious chapters. Sansa is in the Red Keep Royal Sept as Sir Meryn Trant holds the reins for a gilded armor-wearing Joffrey to mount. By the way, Joffrey's just now wearing golden lions on his helmet with red armor. It's as if Cersei has stopped giving a shit about passing Joff off as a Baratheon. Sansa, meanwhile, thinks that Joff looks like a bright, shiny knight, but he's an empty suit on the inside, which is just a fucking sick, awesome burn. Tyrion is there too, and Sansa notes that he has less fine armor and he looks like a kid soldier. But he does have that battle axe strapped to his back, and he has the very, very loyal Sir Mandon Moore at his side. Tyrion notices that Sansa's there and asks whether she's headed over to Maegor's Holdfast to hang out with all the other ladies in the court. She has, but Sansa is so very, very pleased to have been summoned here by Joffrey to send a ball. Sansa is also here to pray. Yes, but Tyrion's not asking who Sansa will be praying for. Regardless of what happens here, Tyrion declares that this day will change everything for him, his house, and even for Sansa. But she'll be so safe as long as Sansa! The boys' shout rang across the yard. Joffrey had seen her. Sansa, here! He calls me as if he were calling a dog, she thought. Tyrion wishes her all the best, hoping to talk to her once the battle is done, and then he's off, and Sansa is bounding over to Joffrey. This truly child soldier gets all saucy down southy, talking about how it's going to be battle so totally soon, and he's so totally going to kill Uncle Stannis in the battle with this new sword. Joffrey drew his sword. The pommel was ruby cut in the shape of a heart set between a lion's jaws. 3 fullers were deeply incised in the blade. My new blade, Heart Eater. He'd opened a sword named Lion's Tooth once. He'd owned a sword named Lion's Tooth once, Sansa remembered. Arya had taken it from him and thrown it in a river. I hope Stannis does the same with this one. It's beautifully wrought, Your Grace. Bless my steel with a kiss. He extended the blade down to her. Go on, kiss it. He never sounded more like a stupid little boy. Sansa forces herself to kiss the sword, thinking that she'd rather kiss a sword than Joffrey, but she notices that Joffrey is pleased with the gesture. He tells Sansa that he wants her to kiss the blade when it's red with Stannis' blood. Sansa thinks Joffrey actually killing his uncle with a sword is somewhat unlikely, given that he would have all these men around him. They'd kill Stannis for Joffrey, though, if he ever came within, I guess, sword shot. But Sansa has a question for Joffrey. Will you lead your knights into battle? Sansa asked, hoping. I would, but my uncle, the imp, says my uncle Stannis will never cross the river. I'll command the 3 horse, though. I'm going to siege the traitors myself. The prospect made Joff smile. His plump pink lips always made him look pouty. Sansa had liked that once, but now it made her sick. They say my brother Robb always goes where the fight is thickest, she said recklessly, though he's older than Your Grace, to be sure. A man grown. That made him frown. I'll deal with your brother after I'm done with my traitor uncle. I'll gut him with Heart Eater. You'll see. Shirk it. But then Joffrey is all flanked by Meryn Trant and Osmond Kettleblack with 4 gold cloaks around him. Tyrion brings up the rear, guards cheer, and then there's silence. In that silence, Sansa hears singing and turns back to the sept as others turn with her. Sansa sees that the sept was crowded and lit well. Part of the reason why it was lit so well was that everyone had lit candles to all the aspects of the 7. Lots of candles were in front of the mother and the warriors' altars, but the father, Smith, Crone, and Maid had candles lit for them. And there were even candles lit to the stranger. Why? This is one of my favorite lines from all of Song of Ice and Fire, and I just love this from Sansa. For what was Stannis Baratheon if not the stranger come to judge them? Sansa lights a candle at each of the 7, and then she takes a seat in the pews as everyone joins together in a hymn, which I'm going to do for you to the tune of Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, which of course is just amazing, an amazing hymn. Gentle Mother, font of mercy, save our sons from war, we pray. Stay the swords and stay the arrows. Let them know a better day. Gentle mother, strength of women, help our daughters through this fray. Soothe the wrath and tame the fury. Teach us all a kinder way. As they sing, Sansa thinks that there are thousands of civilians and Baelor's sept singing. She hopes that the gods are listening. She knows all the hymns anyways with all the people around her. Old serving men, young wives, serving girls, soldiers, cooks, falconers, knights, knaves, squires, spit boys, and nursing mothers. She sang with those inside the castle walls and those without, sang with all the city. She sang for mercy, for the living and the dead alike, for Bran and Rickon and Robb, and for her sister Arya and her bastard brother Jon Snow away off on the wall. She sang for her mother and her father, for her grandfather Lord Hoster and her uncle Edmure Tully, for her friend Jane Poole, the old drunken King Robert, for Septa Mordane, and for Sir Dantos and Jory Cassel and Maester Luwin, and for all the brave knights and soldiers who would die today, and for the children and the wives who would mourn them, and finally, toward the end, she even sang for Tyrion the Imp and for the Hound. He is no true knight, but he saved me all the same, she told the mother. Save him if you can and gentle the rage inside of him. The Septon rises up to the high seat, petitions and then petitions the gods to defend the true and noble king. Upset that the High Septon was praying for Joffrey, not Stannis. Okay, fine, a boy can dream. All the same, Sansa thinks that this guy is full of shit, rises to her feet and pushes her way out of the sept as the Septon drones on about the warrior giving Joffrey strength. She hopes his courage fails and everyone deserts him. Get his ass, Sansa. Sansa pauses outside and listens to the far-off sounds of the battle. War horns, catapults, splashes, splinterings, burning pitch, scorpions of and the cries of dying men. She thinks it's like another song, a terrible one. Sansa moves to Maegor's holdfast, and she comes across Lady Tanda and her daughters at the bridge over the dry moat. Tanda's daughter Felice had arrived just yesterday, and now she was trying to get Lolly Stokeworth across the bridge. I don't want to. I don't want to. I don't want to. The battle has begun, Lady Tanda said in a brittle voice. I don't want to. I don't want to. Sansa asks if she could help them, but Tanda is looking shameful, says no. Lolly's has not been feeling so well lately. Sansa notices a slim, pretty girl with short, dark hair and thinks that she wants to push the girl into a dry mode, even as Lolly's continues to yell that she doesn't want to. Sansa, being really lovely in this scene, tells Lolly that they'll be protected at Maegor's holdfast, and they'll get to eat and drink. But Lolly still doesn't want to. You have to, her sister Felice said sharply, and that is the end of it. Shay, help me. They each took an elbow and together half dragged and half carried Lolly's across the bridge. Sansa followed with their mother. She's been sick, Lady Tanda said. If a babe had been turned to sickness, Sansa thought, it was common gossip that Lolly's was with child. Sansa passes sellswords dressed up like Lannister sworn men guarding the door and on, and she goes on into the Queen's ballroom. This ballroom wasn't as big as the small hall in the Tower of the Hand, but it could still seat 100 people and seemed graceful with all the silver mirrors, rushes, and music playing from the balcony. Almost all of the noble women of the city, along with some old dudes and youngins, sit at the tables. The women were all related by marriage, parentage, or birth to the men fighting Stannis, and everyone knows that many of them wouldn't be coming home alive, and everyone also feels the weight of that knowledge. Sansa moves to sit at Queen Cersei's right hand, but she sees Sir Ilyn Payne standing in the shadows. He almost seems to notice her stare and starts to turn towards her. What is he doing here? She asked Osfryd Kettleblack. He captained the Queen's new Red Cloak Guard. Osfryd grinned. Oh, her grace expects she'll have need of him before the night's done. Sir Ilyn was the king's justice. There was only one service that might be needed. Whose head does she want? But before Sansa can get her question answered, her grace, Cersei, is announced by the royal steward. Cersei shows up dazzling as she always does, wearing a snowy white gown, same color as the king's guard cloak. Her sleeves were lined with golden satin, her blonde hair curled down to her bare shoulders. She looks innocent, almost like a maid, but there was color on her cheeks. Cersei asks that everyone be seated and that everyone is so very, very welcome here. She turns to Sansa. You look pale, Sansa, Cersei observed. Is your red flower still blooming? Yes. How apt. The men will bleed out there, and you in here. The queen signaled for the first course to be served. Why is Sir Ilyn here? Sansa blurted out. The queen glanced at the mute headsman. To deal with treason and to defend us if needs be. He was a knight before he was a headsman. She pointed her spoon toward the end of the hall where the tall wooden doors had been closed and barred. When the axes smash down those doors, you may be glad of him. I would be glad if he were the hound, Sansa thought. Harsh as Sandra Clegane was, she did not believe he would let any harm come to her. Won't your guards protect us? Well, according to Cersei, they need protection from said guards. She says this while side-eyeing Osfrey Kettleblack, and then we get an all-timer for Cersei. Loyal sellswords, well, they are rare as virgin whores. If the battle is lost, my guards will trip on those crimson cloaks in their haste to rip them off. They'll steal what they can and flee, along with the serving men, washerwomen, and stable boys, all out to save their own worthless hides. Do you have any notion what happens when a city is sacked, Sansa? No, you wouldn't, would you? All you know of life you've learned from singers, and there's such a dearth of good sacking songs. True knights would never harm women and children. The words rang hollow in her ears even as Sansa said them. True knights. The queen seemed to find that wonderfully amusing. Oh, no doubt you're right, Sansa. So why don't you just sit there and eat your broth like a good girl and wait for Simeon Star Eyes and Prince Aemon the Dragonite to come rescue you, sweetling. I'm sure it won't be very long now. And that is A Clash of Kings, Sansa 5. You know, it's kind of a short chapter, and there's going to be several short chapters as we get into the Blackwater here. But I think this is a really excellent chapter, even though it's short, and it sets us up really well for the Blackwater. What'd you think, sir?
Well, all through A Clash of Kings, this has been our destination. Arriving here with you feels like we've been driving to Vegas at night, and now we're seeing the lights suddenly emerge before us. The Battle of Blackwater is the climax of the book, and the most iconic battle sequence of the entire story so far. It's a work of staggering ambition, unfolding across 3 different POVs, while the rest wait in the wings. George is putting everything he has as an artist into every aspect of this gargantuan set piece, and in every aspect, it succeeds. Imagery, suspense, characterization, the shocking twists and turns of the battle itself, all of it is as sublime as it's possible to be, in both concept and execution. Sansa 5 is not the most attention-grabbing of the 6 chapters that make up the Blackwater. There's no wildfire in this one. But it sets the tone perfectly, and does so in an emotionally moving way. Even before we see the battle, we can feel it begin.
Yeah, you really do feel like the sense of dread and excitement, maybe both at the same time for me anyways, as the battle's approaching for Sansa. And I really did kind of like harken back to something you were saying back in Sansa 4. I love that point you were making, that Sansa is going to be our primary point of view for the battle and its aftermath. And I think a really strong piece of evidence for your viewpoint can be found here. This is really the first true Battle of the Blackwater chapter. George has successfully set the Battle of Blackwater up in all the previous Sansa and Tyrion chapters, but here the war horns are sounding, catapults are throwing stones, and the screams of dying men can be heard faintly in the distance. To get this through Sansa's point of view first is both unique and awesome. Unique because the roles of women and non-combatants on the battlefield are typically minimized in fictional fantasy settings or even in historical tellings of actual sacks and sieges, unless it's after the city has been taken and there's a sack underway. And then the accounts are really about how sad that this would occur. Take me to the fainting couch. With Sansa, George wants us to look before any potential sack and slaughter. He wants the camera pulled away from the action and wants an auditory experience. It's like the civilians of Rohan hiding in the caves of Helm's Deep. Yes, my wife and I have been watching Lord of the Rings. Spare me. Listening to the orcs bang their spear butts against the ground. The sounds of war are barely within earshot, and we come away from the experience feeling the heightened danger and excitement for me, and ready to see this goddamn thing explode.
You make an excellent point that George engages our ears before he engages our eyes. Sansa is listening to the battle approach. But not only that, she's also listening to everyone singing in response to the sounds of battle. The sounds overlap what she calls a strange and fearful music. It's the auditory equivalent of when Arya smelled both cooking meat and corruption at the same time that you talked about back in the Riverlands.
Yes.
This is what it means for both Stark sisters to grow up, hovering on the threshold between innocence and experience. It's all in where you're standing, as Ygritte told Jon. Sansa is literally and figuratively standing in such a way as to hear both kinds of songs. The hopeful sound of prayer is shot through with the battle hymn of the stranger, the knowledge with maturity that we are forsaken. It's a layering effect of both sounds and tones, as though Sansa is looking at the world through glasses with lenses of different colors. This process isn't just happening to Sansa, however. She is taking part in it. She gets that the element in common between these two sets of sounds is the desire for divine intervention. Please save us from ourselves. Those who can't fight pray out loud to the mother for her mercy. Those who must fight pray silently to the warrior for luck in battle against the enemy. As Sansa realizes, these prayers are contradictory. The prayer to the mother asks for an end to the battle. Everyone cast down your spears. The prayer to the warrior, however, is a prayer for victory and for courage. Don't let me flinch from the killing blow when the moment comes, as Brienne will talk about in A Feast for Crows. These prayers, they both can't come true. Yet Sansa remembers being told that the seven are faces of a singular god. The warrior and mother are one. How does that one god manage contradictory prayers? It's the same point Jaime made to Catelyn. No matter what you do, you're forsaking a promise. Sansa is starting to critically interrogate the systems in which she was raised, the unquestioned assumptions as familiar as the stories. She notes that even as the singers try to drown out the sounds of battle, she could still hear men dying if she tried to, if she pays attention. And she is no longer able to drown it out because, her father's execution and the bread riots, it's all just crashing down.
I'm reminded of one of my really good friends is a really strong Catholic, and whenever I would ask him questions about theology that he just didn't have a good answer, he would say, it's a mystery. It's a mystery. And then you could feel that throughout these questions that Sansa is posing about how can the God as multiple seven persons answer contradicting, conflicting prayers. It's a mystery. Well, unless you believe that the faith is seven are not real, which of course they seem very much to be not in this series. And I think also too, you were talking about everything crashing down and what it means to have these contradictory senses going on. It's kind of George's continued play on this idea that sweet smells are sometimes used to cover up foul ones. But here he's engaging a different sense besides smell, namely sound, as I was talking about before. Harp music can cover up the sounds of people dying in the distance. We kind of close our ears to things that upset us, or we try to distract ourselves because Sansa is subconsciously thinking that it could be her dying moments she could be hearing very soon. And that's a thought pattern that could drive her and us, frankly, mad. Another contradictory aspect of all this praying is that the people praying for the mother's mercy or the warrior's strength are hoping that the same prayers offered by the enemy won't be answered. I mean, remember, not everyone in Stannis' side is a signatory on to R'hllor. In fact, many of these folks were fighting for Renly just a few weeks before this moment. So, and they're also praying, and many still and will continue to profess allegiance to the faith of the seven after the Battle of Blackwater. Davos Seaworth being only the most prominent example, as we find out in A Storm of Swords. Does the divine show favoritism to one side or another? That's certainly what everyone on all sides is hoping here. It speaks to something, because you referenced this, you name dropped the Forsaken before, I have to bring it up again. It speaks to something we covered in the Forsaken episodes. God, are you there? Do you care about me, Aaron Dampere, Sansa Stark, Davos Seaworth, Tyrion Lannister? If we lose, have you forsaken us? Have you stopped caring about us and loving us? That forsaken feeling is what Davos will experience on that speck of rock that he ends up early in A Storm of Swords. And here at the start of Sansa 5 in A Clash of Kings, it's equally wrenching. Sansa knows there is no escape even if her prayers for survival in this moment are answered. Cersei is still going to be around even if they win. Tyrion might be around as well, and Joffrey will definitely fucking remain.
Yeah, speaking of Joffrey, Sansa didn't wander over here of her own accord. She was summoned by Joffrey, as in her earlier chapters in the book, as a prize pet. That's what Sansa amounts to in Joffrey's eyes, as she realizes. She gets her revenge for this constant humiliation the only place she can, in her thoughts, which she shares with us. She sums up Joffrey perfectly. Bright, shining, and empty. That's the contrast between the image and the reality George hammers home throughout Sansa's story. She used to be all about the bright and shining surface. Now she can perceive the emptiness underneath. The king on the Iron Throne is an empty suit of armor, a shadow on a wall. His claim is illegitimate, his behavior is sadistic, his leadership non-existent. The splendid red and gold armor does not indicate his inner worth, but rather covers up for the lack of same. Beauty can be turned against you. That's a lesson Sansa has had to learn, very painfully.
Absolutely. And at the same time, one of her teachers has been Cersei Lannister. And I'm just kind of scratching my head at the optics of Cersei sending Joffrey out to battle in Lannister colors, because it's either, it's both of these things. It's both not very bright, and also probably signaling that Cersei doesn't give a shit anymore. Let me explain. Davos is later going to remark that Stannis' navy should have come into King's Landing with Baratheon colors and fought in Robert's name instead of a stranger, and which has a dual meaning, of course, the stranger's banner. And that applies here, but kind of in reverse. Everyone knows that the Lannister colors are red and gold and that the Lannisters are blonde of hair. And now that Stannis' letter has gone out and has made its way out to the population, as evidenced by all those people declaring Cersei a brotherfucker and Joffrey a bastard during the riot in King's Landing, Cersei now sends him into battle looking the very soul of a Lannister. Now, Cersei may be thinking that Joff should look like Jaime Lannister in his swirling crimson finery to inspire the men, or, as maybe more likely the case, she's flaunting her own ego by having Joffrey go into battle looking as Lannister as humanly possible. This angle works almost as if Cersei is sending Joffrey out on a suicidal last charge because she thinks that the city is going to fall anyways. As we get more into the Blackwater, that does seem to be Cersei's perspective. She gets drunker, lets down her guard and facade, and starts talking about how Sir Ilyn Payne is going to be killing everyone because she won't be able to seduce Stannis into sparing her life. So if she goes out, she's going to go out in Lannister style, not giving a damn about telegraphing that Joffrey is a Lannister through and through.
Yeah, I think you're right. That is consistent with Cersei's personality as it continues to disintegrate, as we'll see in the Sansa chapters to come. Tyrion, by contrast, doesn't fit the beauty standard you're talking about. He's the adult, not Joffrey, but Sansa says he looks like a child in his armor. There's nothing childish about that battle axe of his, however, because unlike Joffrey, Tyrion will actually be riding into battle. So you got style versus substance there. And certainly that makes us more inclined to admire Tyrion than Joffrey. But Tyrion is unslinging that axe to keep Joffrey in power. He tells his men different in the moment to hold them together when he's leading that sortie, but I mean, that's the outcome of Tyrion's suicidally brave last stand, is that the bright, shining, empty king wins. As he is throughout the book, Tyrion is caught here between his personal desire to do justice, as he said, and his political imperative to toe the Lannister company line. Tyrion thinks too late that he really should have sent Sansa off to safety with Tommen, but he can only abandon her now to Cersei's tender mercies. His attempt to reach out to her courteously is limited by the awkward mutual awareness that they are on different sides of this war. As he says, he can't assume Sansa is praying for the Lannisters. He won't ask. He doesn't want to know. There can be no honesty between them.
Yeah, it's interesting because the lack of honesty between Tyrion and Sansa is an extension of much the same between Tyrion and the rest of his family. When Tyrion jokes around with Sansa about not asking who she's praying for, it engenders some sympathy for Tyrion because, hey, look at that. Someone who has self-awareness of this nest of fucking liars. But that sympathy only extends so far. As you were saying, Tyrion knows that he's fighting on behalf of a monster, and he knows that injustice is flowing from the Iron Throne. And yet Tyrion has been inculcated with a twisted notion of family first by Tywin and operating in his Lord Father's stead. And much like Tywin, that family first motto revolves around self-preservation. And that self-preservation is sourced to the lie that is Joffrey as both Robert's true-born son and also that Joffrey is the true king in action. So much of what we've seen in A Clash of Kings is Joffrey acting like a slightly more restrained version of Aerys II Targaryen, sociopathic murders, psychosexual assaults on Sansa, tortures, etc. On this read for Tyrion, though, I got this impression of Rhaegar when he's riding out to the Trident from King's Landing, knowing that he's supporting a monster on the Iron Throne. Rhaegar might have told Jaime that, quote, changes will be made, as Jaime reveals in A Feast for Crows. But first, you got to, go and kill the rebels who, by the way, were righteous and rising against my dad's delegitimizing sociopathy. The same delegitimizing sociopathy that I was probably attempting to overthrow just 2 years past at the Tourney of Harrenhal. Isn't that kind of Tyrion too here? He's fighting for Aerys Light, riding out to battle against the rightful king, by birth at least, fighting for an unjust cause. And that begs the question, can you fight honorably for dishonorable people and causes? No. This is no personal ramifications for me whatsoever. It's not something that I struggle with on the reg. Nothing at all to do with me personally, of course.
At least you do struggle with it. Joffrey has no such conflict going on. He's well beyond such moral conflicts. He unabashedly treats Sansa like a prop, using her to inflate his ego prior to battle. I say prior to battle. But Joffrey never gets anywhere close to the actual battle. It's all stage management on Tyrion's part. Joffrey wants Sansa to kiss his sword to work out his developing sexual desires, rooted in his love of domination in all forms. He promises that she'll kiss Stannis' blood and then Robb's, but it's play acting, every bit as much as Sansa's performed courtesies. In her head, she revels in the truth. Arya took away Joffrey's previous sword. Maybe Stannis will take this one away. Sansa is afraid of Stannis' fiery banners, but as with the Great Sept, he's a powerful figure in her mind associated with the destruction of everything in King's Landing that she hates. Sansa does break character to taunt Joffrey for his pantomime. Robb is the real deal, she points out, always going where the fighting is thickest. But he's older, a man grown, a king who is more than bright, shining, and empty. Joffrey instead rides off to enjoy his pointless torture. There's a palpable tension in scenes like this as Sansa risks herself by poking at Joffrey, followed by relief on our part that she got away with it. As the tension fades, she's left alone with the rest, as you were saying earlier. It's that behind-the-scenes of war feeling, like with Bran in the Game of Thrones, as you said, when Robb rode off.
That's a great point, and I think that's exactly what George is going for. That same sort of dynamic that Sansa is experiencing here, that Bran experienced back in a Game of Thrones, which is I'll talk about later on between Bran and Sansa. And you have to also admire Sansa's courage and intelligence in this scene. I mean, for one, she's one of the few, besides Tyrion and Sandor Clegane intermittently, who stand up to Joffrey's cruelty. Unlike Tyrion, who can rely on his sellswords and his mountain clansmen, or Sandor, who can rely on his sheer size and ferocity, Sansa is essentially defenseless from Joffrey's brutalities. Yet, she tells this brat that he's less of a warrior than her brother Robb, who of course is older, but also personally leading cavalry charges, besieging castles, and doing the things a storybook warrior king should be doing in a wartime setting. On the point about Robb being older, I love how Sansa helps to fulfill an earlier plot point from all the way back in a Game of Thrones, when Joffrey and Robb are sparring at Winterfell Yard, and we get this exchange. Robb may be a child, Joffrey said. I am a prince, and I grow tired of swatting at Starks with the blazed sword. You got more swats than you gave, Joff, Robb said. Are you afraid? Prince Joffrey looked at him. Oh, terrified, he said. You're so much older. And then later, come and see me when you're older, Stark, if you're not too old. Now, as we were talking about back in that scene, when George was writing that in the Game of Thrones, this is very early on, and likely a scene that was written before he dispatched his pitch letter out to his book agent in 1993. So that was actually setting groundwork for the pitch letter, which talks about Robb killing Joffrey in battle. But I actually, coming back to it now, I'd rather prefer the way that George pays it off. Sansa getting to tell Joffrey off one last time, showing the king that Robb is not merely playing at war the way that Joffrey is about to. And as it turns out, Joffrey will be terrified to be in his first battle and will be yanked from the battlefield when he's not in any real danger anyhow, resulting in the collapse of Lannister morale and the near collapse of the Lannister cause altogether. These optics, the beauty and chivalry that Joffrey rides out to battle with, they all end up proving empty as Joffrey proves a hollow suit of armor and comes running home to mama.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love how George just threads Joffrey's uselessness and pointless bravado throughout the whole battle and afterwards, like in the scene in the throne room in Sansa's final chapter in this book when he cuts himself on the Iron Throne and screams for Cersei. And that's the last we see of him, the victorious king in the book A Clash of Kings. And that's just a very, very pointed message, I think, on George's part. So the heart of this chapter, of course, is Sansa joining the singers in the sept. It's beautiful imagery put in service of pure feeling. George lovingly describes the shafts of sunlight turned into rainbows by the crystals, the candles twinkling everywhere like stars, as though we're in the cosmos. It's the rainbow style of A Clash of Kings in full bloom. We talk about George as a lapsed Catholic a fair amount, but he clearly still loves the aesthetic of the Mother Church. In that way, he's a lot like Martin Scorsese, another boomer icon raised in that same New York area. Scorsese originally dreamed of entering the priesthood. He wound up worshipping at the altar of movies instead, but all of his movies, even his gangster movies, reflect his love for the idea, if not the reality, of Catholicism. In Mean Streets, the protagonist, Charlie, played by Harvey Keitel, stares at a display of votive candles, the shine reflected in his eyes. In voiceover, he passionately decries the rituals of the church and declares he'll worship in his own way. The scene with Sansa in the sept has a similar meaning to it. Sansa is losing her faith in the institutions and stated beliefs of her religion. And yet there's something magical about this moment. The candles, the rainbow light, the singing. She can't help but be swept up in it all. There we go. And George just writes it so beautifully. The air was hot and heavy, smelling of incense and sweat, crystal kissed and candle bright. It made her dizzy to breathe it. The sept briefly functions the way temples are supposed to, as oases from the fallen world in which we can reach for something higher. A sense of harmony prevails. All 7 faces of God are being worshipped, just as the sounds blurred together outside. The mother and the warrior have their candles, but so too do smith, crone, maid, father, and even the shadowy face of the stranger. Catelyn said in the sept down at Storm's End that she could get no comfort from the face of the stranger because the stranger stands in for death. The stranger is an outcast, dwelling in the spaces between things, half human and unknowable, observing, judging, waiting for us to falter. The stranger is terrifying, yet to ignore them does not diminish their power. Catelyn looked away from the stranger's face, but they arrived all the same in the form of Stannis' shadow to slay Renly. The worshippers in this sept do not look away from the stranger like Catelyn. Instead, they worship the stranger along with the rest, albeit not as enthusiastically. One must stare into the face of death to live fully, and that's what they're doing here.
That's a great point. I think it's hard when you're in the potential of dying, but very proximately instead of like something being far off or even something being academic. It's very much within earshot, as we talked about. And I think it's also a brilliant bit of transition to have Sansa go from the empty suits of beautiful gleaming armor and false chivalry to a beautiful sept burning incense and candles, but no substance behind said optics. George himself, as we've talked about as well, besides being a lapsed Catholic, is agnostic on whether God in the real world or gods exist. And that agnosticism gets its extension in the faith of the 7 in A Song of Ice and Fire. There very likely is nothing behind the 7 statues and aspects of God, as there is no faith of the 7 God behind it all. It's just a series of beautiful images and gorgeous rituals that captivate Sansa and the rest of the congregants in the sept. However, just because there is no ethereal power there, it doesn't mean that these images are still not powerful in and of themselves. All the candles burning, casting light and shadows on the wall mean something. Power resides where men believes it resides. And here in this sept, power resides in those images because people have imbued power onto them. As we record this episode, we're entering into the Christmas season in the United States in 2020. And even though I kind of personally look at a lot of the traditions I grew up around as see them as kind of empty and hollow, I also can't shake that feeling that Sansa and the rest of the congregants, and even George seems to feel when he enters a church, if he enters a church. Those images, however false, give the illusion of safety to those congregants, much as the prayers offered to the warrior by the men on and under the walls of King's Landing give comfort and even strength to the men about to die. That's the true power here, but as we'll find out in A Feast for Crows, the image can only extend and only take the people in King's Landing so far. There has to be a there behind the images, and the Sparrows, unfortunately, will provide that there in just 2 books' time.
Yeah, you're right. That's when the politics of the faith of the 7 become much more concrete. And here it seems to be more about, a metaphor for power and a metaphor for how art works. As I said, in the Stormlands, the gods are archetypes we apply to our own lives, figurative masks to wear, just as with storytelling. Sansa has now matured enough to make this connection. The metaphorical leap from the archetype to the individual. Who is the stranger? She asks. Stannis, she answers. He is the face of death for these people now, as he was for Catelyn. I love this line when she says, "Who is Stannis Baratheon but the stranger come to judge us?" It perfectly captures Stannis as an intense figure of Catholic dread and guilt, as I talked about him upon his introduction in the prologue to this book. We are all sinners. We will all be judged and punished accordingly. This is the cleansing fire foreshadowed by the street preacher in Tyrion 6. The comparison to the stranger also further establishes Stannis' duality. The stranger is morally ambiguous, a shapeshifter, just as Stannis is made up of equal parts hero and villain, both playing themselves out in his story. Sansa is eager for the destruction of House Lannister that he currently represents, but also afraid of what will happen to the city and herself in the process. She lights a candle to him and all the rest for joining the singers at the benches. She sits between an old woman and a boy as young as Rickon. That's the full arc of life right there. Youth, maturation, and aging, all sitting together like links in a chain. They're like the gods, like the threefold goddess, maid, mother, and crone. But they're not gods, they're humans, thrown together by the war. I think George is suggesting that we can find divine grace, not in literal gods and churches, but in the presence of each other, if only temporarily. This song is not just a tribute to peace. It is peace. This is what it looks like, feels like, sounds like. All the faces we wear, no longer separate, tormented in isolation. The walls come down, and we cherish one another. Sansa thinks that the gods must surely hear them. I don't think that's true. But I also think it doesn't really matter. What matters is how good it feels for Sansa to have someone to hold on to, the comfort a touch can give, as her mother said to Brienne. And yeah, the hymn reminds Sansa of her mother, happier days at Winterfell. Catelyn herself had learned that hymn in her cherished childhood days at Riverrun. After that innocence died in the war, she carried the hymn with her to the cold north with its nameless gods and passed it on to her kids, a fragment of home. And that's what it is for Sansa now, a fragment of home. And so Sansa sings her battle hymn, a plea for peace, not a negotiated ceasefire, not a reworking of government policy. She pleads not for a pragmatic political transformation, but a seismic spiritual one. She pleads for the gods to teach us how not to fight. Help us decide as one that it is acceptable to throw down our arms and refuse. Teach us how to improve ourselves. Teach us a kinder way so we can soothe our fury. I come back, as I always do, to the great American novel Gravity's Rainbow, and a fantasy of peace in there where the characters just long for the leaders of the world to just say, and I quote, "Oh, fuck it. I'm sending all the soldiers home. We'll close down the weapon factories. We'll dump all the weapons in the sea. I'm sick of war. I'm sick of waking up every morning, afraid I'm going to die." Sansa has been tapping into a sick dread undergirding everything, a collective emotion that demands a response, a need for release. We will see this emotion unleashed in the joyous bells that follow the battle. Sansa is praying for something worth surviving for. Her prayer is answered not by the gods, but by the people around her. She's singing with all kinds of people, all ages, all classes. She's singing for people outside the sept, those on the walls, those on the ships, those who will die, and those who will be left behind. Sansa is affirming their common humanity, even after everything she's been through, and despite everything they are all about to go through. In singing, she reaches out to her family and her friends, the living and the dead, the residents of the world of her childhood. This is the only way she can connect with them. It's not the real thing, but it's all she has. She even sings for Tyrion and Sandor. Within the space of a song, you can achieve empathy. It's a metaphor for art and how it puts us in the shoes of another. It can make you want mercy for them.
Yeah, and that aspect of mercy is brought up so strongly in how Sansa phrases it to Sandor Clegane, and when she's thinking about him, because she's seeing for the mother's mercy for the hound here in this scene. And knowing that Sandor Clegane's mother disappeared in mysterious Gregorian circumstances, Sansa acts as mother to Sandor Clegane here, signaling the role she'll occupy in her penultimate chapter when Sandor Clegane shows up back in her room. And I was saying this in the mini-sode, it's almost as if Sansa is singing, again, because I'm watching Lord of the Rings with my wife, that scene with when Aragorn is gentling the horse that was ridden by Theoden's son, who has gone mad after the battle, and Aragorn is petting and talking gently to the horse. It's almost like she's singing to a wild animal, attempting to gentle the rage and horror and fear within him. Even this song, "Gentle Mother," it's the same from this scene that we have here in the sept to that scene in her penultimate chapter that she sings to Sandor Clegane. And Sandor Clegane responds to what Sansa is putting forward, that offer of mercy and the gentle mother, the mother that he never had, because he weeps at the end of that song and says, "Little dove" or "little bird," and then he walks away. And that song is just coming just 2 Sansa chapters from now, and that fulfillment is just so emotionally resonant and powerful. It makes me even have a very spare emotion.
Empathy is an amazing experience. It can make you look at a person, look at yourself a whole new way. But there are limits. As soon as the Septon calls upon the gods to defend Joffrey, Sansa stands and leaves, shouldering her way past everyone. She wishes not mercy upon Joffrey, but the opposite. Failure, humiliation, a curse called down from the gods. The mood of harmony disappears. That's not necessarily a bad thing, however. Rather, Sansa is establishing mature limitations on her empathy. Joffrey does not deserve it. He does not deserve it because of his treatment of her, and also because his power and behavior winds up getting in the way of empathetic politics kind of all the time. One of the great human contradictions is that an ideal world has a place for everyone, but there are people who will stand directly in the way of that world, so what place can there be for them? In order to create a more loving world, the obstacles must be seen as such, without that love getting in the way. How do you manage that paradox? It's similar to the agonizing questions Jon and Dany face in A Dance with Dragons. You want a world in which humanity, all of humanity, unites against the others. But how do you unite with the likes of Ramsay? You want a world at peace. But how do you make peace with people determined to roll back liberation? No one really has that figured out. Growing up is about trying to get better at it, especially get better than your forebears. This is Sansa trying to make sense of it, and I think it's a powerful moment on that basis.
I absolutely agree. It's an extremely powerful moment to have her recognize that there's limitations on the kind of pacifist mindset of beating swords into plowshares, because Joffrey will continue committing violence on Sansa and will never stop until he is stopped himself. What separates Joffrey from Sandor Clegane and Tyrion Lannister, and I think this is interesting because these are people who are fighting on behalf of Joffrey, is that both of these men seemingly is that Joffrey seemingly doesn't worship at the altar of the warrior who quote unquote defends the weak. Joffrey, in a weird way, might find a more relatable religious home in Brulor of Melisandre burning innocents at the pyre. The distinguishing factor is one you were referencing a few weeks back. You know, most of the people who are fighting in wars are just normal, everyday people who commit a war crime here and there, like your Steelshanks Waltons, but they return to some form of peace thereafter. That's most people. That's not true for Ramsay or Gregor or the Tower Prince or the Weeper. Fuck that guy, or especially Joffrey of House Baratheon. The dude telling Sansa that he wants her to kiss his sword when it's red with blood, yeah, that demonstrates someone who isn't into this war shit to defend the people. They're all in on the violence in terms of inflicting hurt and pain and death upon people. For peace to occur, this is just my opinion, they have to be stopped. And so far in the story and in the real world, there hasn't been a means to do so other than violence itself, which of course is another like inherently human contradiction in the human condition, I think.
So Sansa kind of runs away from those sounds, those horrible kind of human contradictions clashing outside the walls. She leaves the sept and she walks to Maegor's Holdfast, where she will spend all of Sansa 6 and the first chunk of Sansa 7. As Sansa describes it, Maegor's Holdfast is a castle within a castle. It's as far from the battle as possible. Cersei has promised the noble-born non-combatants of the Red Keep that they will be safe here. George spends this final part of the chapter showing us all the ways that's not true. There's no safety to be found anywhere. In Sansa 6, Cersei will make that clear in multiple ways. I mean, it's Maegor's Holdfast. Even a first-time reader has been made familiar with Maegor, one of the worst Targaryen monarchs. This is not a comforting sign. Right away, Sansa sees the illusion breaking down. At the drawbridge, she comes across the Stokeworth women. Felice has recently returned to King's Landing with a fresh levy of troops, the image of security. Everything's going to be fine. But that feeling of security is not taking hold, even among the Stokeworths themselves. Lawless is holding everyone up, refusing to enter the Holdfast. Lawless doesn't articulate why she doesn't want to go inside. More than likely, she can't. It doesn't seem like Lawless ever gave free rein to her emotions before, and now she's been traumatized by gang rape. She might be terrified of the social obligations, or of Cersei as an individual, or of any son of the war. The point is that she's been reduced to expressing her fears in the most repetitive and childish fashion, yet her own relatives have no sympathy for her. Certainly, it must be trying to face these struggles with Lawless every day. I certainly, as I said before, kind of feel for Shay in this situation because she has just no power whatsoever. But it's chilling to see how Lawless's mother and sister are more concerned with what others will think of them. Just as Cersei is pretending that they are safe, so do the Stokeworths try to conceal Lawless's raw pain from sight, lest it embarrass them. In both cases, the norms of polite society demand that you lie. These people cannot honestly address what is happening to and around them. Tanda even lies about Lawless's kind of obvious pregnancy, pretending she's sick. They refuse to afford her the slightest of dignities. Sansa is a more well-intentioned individual than Tanda and Felice Stokeworth. She speaks to Lollys gently. Her human decency persists even in this situation. But the specific words she uses to try and make Lollys feel better are Cersei's words.
Yep.
Sansa is repeating her lies. We're safe here. I don't fault Sansa for that. Telling Lollys the truth is that Lollys is right to be terrified, and the only reason for her to hide it is to make everyone else feel better. Telling her that isn't going to help her. What can Sansa do but lie? The same question arises with Sweet Robin in A Feast for Crows, when Sansa is wondering if there's such thing as an honorable lie. Does Sansa feel comfortable making use of the same sweet lies she herself used to believe?
I mean, I do wonder whether this is a play on what you were describing from that scene in the Sept. It's not the hashtag objective truth. It's about what makes us feel better before the strong possibility at this point of death. It's comforting to be in a castle within city walls, within a holdfast of that castle. There are several layers of protection from the men who are trying to kill, rape, and slaughter the people inside. And even though Lollys is scared, and even though Felice, Tanda, and Shay are acting pretty shamefully, there is value in sweet-sounding lies here. Maybe. That's how Sansa has been operating as a hostage here in King's Landing, learning to lie to protect herself from her oppressors. This is something that's been a defining factor of her arc as she's lying to Joffrey about how much she loves Joffrey and keeps lying to Sandor Clegane about how she hopes that Robb is defeated and how he's a traitor and all those types of things. These are not things that she actually believes. But now she's applying lies to convince someone to do something they don't want to do, attempting to provide comfort to someone else through those lies. Now, at this point in her journey, Sansa might not even be kind of consciously putting it all together, connecting her knowledge that Maegor's holdfast isn't safe with convincing Lollys to cross the dry moat. But later, after further education in King's Landing and in the Eyrie, Sansa will reflect on the lies that Littlefinger tells her, thinking, he is serving me lies as well, Sansa realized. They were comforting lies, though, and she thought them meant kindly. A lie is not so bad if it is kindly meant, if only she believed them. Sansa is starting to make the conscious decision to use lies, and that lies are all right so long as they're kindly meant. I don't know. To me, maybe it's a little bit cynical on my part, but that seems to be like good raw queen making material. That may come in handy later on.
I think there's clear individual cases of it, like with Sansa trying to help Lollys. It's just the question of like what kind of person you become after you do that every day. You know what I mean? Just the cumulative effect. And I think Sansa has a stronger head on her shoulders to begin with, maybe than Littlefinger and Cersei in this regard, but she also just has to watch for that kind of gradual decay, which I think all these older people have dealt with. Mm-hmm. And the theme of comforting deceptions, blurring into scary realities, continues as Sansa steps inside. She knows those aren't proper Lannister guards on the steps. Sure, they wear the Lannister colors, but their undisciplined conduct reveals them to be dressed-up sellswords. Sansa used to focus only on the colors, the image. Now she sees reality revealed through actions. A year ago, Sansa might have believed she was safe with these men. They're wearing the right colors. Now she's starting to know better. A year ago, she would have fallen uncritically in love with the Queen's ballroom. It's all arched windows and reflected light. It's like a cinematographer's dream. Now Sansa can't help but realize that all this beauty exists to cover up fire and blood. The velvet hangings are there to drown out the sound of the battle. And it doesn't matter, Sansa thinks. The battle is with us. We carried it inside like a virus. It's in our trembling hands, our laughter on the verge of sobs. It's all over Sir Ilyn Payne, the embodiment of death in Sansa's storyline, just as he was back in Book 1. Only this time, he has her father's sword, the emblem of family and home, a model of justice worthy of her belief, has been stolen and corrupted, now belonging to her enemy's bloodhound. Ilyn Payne is here, as Osford Kettleblack tells Sansa, because Cersei might need him. That's how Osford Kettleblack puts it, need him. Even this violent, tough guy relies on euphemisms for violence. There's a battle going on outside, but we're still talking about we might need him. Just say it. Sansa has to say the truth in her own mind. Ilyn Payne is here because Cersei anticipates executing people. Again, there is no safety here. George cuts right from that revelation to Cersei's introduction. As the royal steward declares her titles, we should be thinking of this implied violence. That's what undergirds all the beautiful objects and rhetoric in this room. Cersei is dressed in white, making her look innocent, as Sansa says, but the color in her cheeks suggests she has already started drinking, which is impressive given how much she drinks during the battle. Her first words to Sansa cut right through the performed courtesies. "Are you still bleeding? Good. They'll bleed out there and you in here." Now that speaks to how suffering continues in this sheltered space. It's the inverse of the sept, in which people were bonded through faith and hope. Now they're bonded through pain. But this also speaks to Cersei's very particular views on gender. As she will say in Sansa 6, she always felt cheated of the possibilities open to men, all of which in Cersei's mind seem to have to do with violence and death. Men are allowed to go out there and risk themselves in bloodshed. Women must bleed passively inside, waiting for the battle to be over. Cersei reinforces this worldview when she compares, quote, loyal sellswords to, quote, virgin whores. That's what the state of innocence means to the two different genders, as far as Cersei is concerned, and the world quickly takes both kinds of innocence away. As such, Cersei feels free to articulate what Lawless could not. If the battle turns against them, their guards will abandon them to the invaders' tender mercies. Cersei does not, of course, empathize with her fellow women on this basis. She despises them for their weakness and foolishness in her eyes. You can see that clearly in how she treats Sansa. Cersei knows that Sansa has never been educated about what happens during a sack. George is also critiquing fantasy stories that elide the grim realities of what wrestling a city away from the evil villains would really look like in practice. All Sansa can do is parrot what she's been told. True knights would never hurt them. The words ring hollowly on her ears. She has seen too much to believe in that anymore. Ilyn Payne, Meryn Trant, Dantos Hollard, Sandor Clegane, they've all made clear it doesn't quite work that way. Rather than nurture her development, however, Cersei just mocks Sansa for her naivete. Yet her cynicism comes off, if anything, worse. While it is necessary to burst those childish bubbles, George is showing us via Cersei how adulthood does not always translate into maturity. The lies have poisoned Cersei. Will they poison Sansa? And this becomes the drama of the next couple Sansa chapters, I think, really as much as the outcome of the battle itself.
Right. I mean, like the entire dynamic is that Cersei and everyone around Sansa is using euphemism in order to placate Sansa, using sweet sounding words to keep them all in one place so that as soon as the battle actually unfolds and the potential that the city is taken by Stannis, that they can all be basically the way that an animal would be just before he's slaughtered, so to speak, sort of gentled and kept sane. And I think yeah, that dynamic is just really, really bad for Sansa. Sansa and everyone in that room with Cersei knows the reality of what's coming to them. And Cersei is not doing a good job of instructing her potential future daughter-in-law in the form of Sansa. And I think in earlier Clash of Kings Bran chapters, we both talked about how everything that Bran was learning at the feet of Luwin, Roderick, the other people in Winterfell was subtle but explicit royal training for the kid. And we also kind of talked about this too in the context of Sansa, and that she was learning similar things in King's Landing in A Clash of Kings, building her up to her likely future queen in the North role. But with Sansa at chapter's end, it's different in that Sansa's learning how not to rule, as Cersei and her henchmen are doing here at chapter's end. Sansa observes how Cersei is ruling cheerlessly, having headsmen wait around to murder them if things go bad, getting chippy and undercutting the morale in an already tense situation. Now, if season 8 of The Throne Show is a guide for what to expect, then a lot of the what not to do training that Sansa receives here at the Blackwater will be informative to how Sansa holds her own quote-unquote women's court when Winterfell comes under siege from the others. So again, it's the lies, those gentle-sounding lies in order to make people feel comfortable, the optics that she is learning in the sept. It's the chivalry, it's the imagery, it's all coming to a head here. And Sansa's also learning what not to do when a castle is under dire siege. And I have to imagine that the siege of Winterfell by the others is likely going to be much, much more dire than what Stannis could potentially bring to King's Landing, if, and God bless him, if he wins. So I think that's going to about wrap us up for the depth section. Moving on to foreshadowing groundwork. So Sansa hopes that Joffrey's courage fails and that his men desert him. And her prayers are answered in the battle. But sadly, so sadly, Tywin Lannister shows up to save the Lannisters in the nick of time.
Yep, so unfortunate, but yeah, it's I think something George is doing to show that the conduct of the king, while it certainly impacts the battle, I think the Blackwater goes worse than it had from the Lannister side because of what ends up happening with Joffrey. It's not the whole sum of what's going on in the Battle of Blackwater. Neither Joffrey nor Stannis actually end up being central in themselves. It's more just the idea of them, the shadow, you could say, that ends up becoming important to the overall outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, speaking of things to come in the Battle of Blackwater, Joffrey makes a passing reference to killing his uncle. Of course, they're talking about Stannis, and Sansa thinks, what if his Kingsguard might do it for you? And it does come to pass that one of Joffrey's Kingsguard goes after his uncle, but the uncle in question is Tyrion, of course, not Stannis. And I think that's might have been a great slide joke that George worked in there to show that, that on the surface they're talking about Stannis, but actually it's the uncle on the Lannister side, on your own side, that your own Kingsguard are going to go after.
That's going to be so much fun to talk about who actually dispatched Mandamore to try and kill Tyrion when we get to that portion of the Battle of the Blackwater in just a few weeks' time. But yeah, I love George's subtle, sly references here, and the way that he does the interplay with wordplay, and the way that he tries to foreshadow things in a very subtle way. And as George has said before, he does this intentionally to reward people who are rereading and reading in depth, and that's the kind of stuff that he loves. Which of course is which I take to be a George basically endorsing the Not a Cast podcast being the penultimate, the ultimate reread podcast of A Song of Ice and Fire. So moving away from foreshadowing groundwork and talking more about theory discussion. Now, there really isn't a theory we could talk about Sansa Stark and the future of the Winds of Winter or A Dream of Spring. A lot of it's going to come in these future Sansa chapters in the Clash of Kings. But we are here at the Battle of the Blackwater. And I figured to ask you, Emmett, what do you make of the battle as a generally peacenik guy? And maybe I'm describing you wrongly, and you can correct me if I am wrong. And how do you think George, a fellow generally peacenik guy, how does he end up writing some of the finest battle prose in modern fiction? And while we're at it, I'll jump in and talk about all the glorious work George is doing with the Battle of Blackwater and what it says for the major battle set pieces that he's planning to open the Winds of Winter. So I turn it over to you, sir. How do you make of the Battle of the Blackwaters as both a Stannis loyalist ? And also as Emmett Booth, the guy behind the Pork Button fandom presence.
Well, I think in terms of how George writes the battle prose, I think he approaches it, especially from Davos's perspective, as horror more than as dry, a description of the battle formations. And he does the same thing with the attack of the White Walkers and the Army of the Dead beyond the wall and Storm of Swords. But I think also, as George has talked about, he understands in a kind of, again, guilty, furtive Catholic way, the appeal of war as the essence of a romantic expression of humanity. And also because, as he says, real life, peaceful life, it's great because it's not violent, but it's also kind of boring. And that's why a lot of people try to leave it. People who can't make peace with it or make sense of it or can't deal with the repetition of it. Like he says, fantasy is jetting off to Middle Earth, and reality is just, flying Southwest Airlines to Ohio. That's what peace looks like. And, I think George understands the kind of the need for wars being connected at some deep psychological level to the adolescent need for adventure that inspires fantasy stories, and also Victorian novels of adventure stories of people wandering all over the world and not caring what culture they were trampling on. These things go together, and I think George is aware of that and teasing that out. I mean, me personally, when I come at battle fiction, the thing I find insidious and bad about war isn't even first and foremost the battle itself. It's that there are it's the people who use it as a governing tool and use it as a way to, inflict shock value on economies and then scoop up a lot of money. And I think that is something that's constant in war, no matter what era or what part of the world you're talking about. And we see it here. I mean, people are people are basically betting on the Battle of Blackwater on both sides and trying to speculate a bunch of money off of it. And Salador Sand winkles himself a title over it, but just keeps being a pirate on the Blackwater Bay. That's the kind of stuff that haunts me about war policy and about, really just centralized estate policy in general. It's just got its most blunt and horrifying, I think, in war policy, is that it's never just about the tip of the spear collision between armies, as horrifying as that often is. It's about the people watching. It's not people in a tower going good. George doesn't like those villains for a reason, but that to come back to Gravity's Rainbow, that the true war is a celebration of markets, as Pynchon wrote in Gravity's Rainbow, and that's just to be aware that really what you're doing in the process of war is breaking down how much a human being is worth in its most primal form, and that process, I think, is overall bad for humanity, even if you can point to plenty of situations where really the only solution is going in there with a bunch of guys and spears. Like, yeah, I understand that there are plenty of those situations. It's just as a governing principle, I don't. What other governing principles are there for society other than war? We've done a terrible job coming up with them. So it's not like I have a solution for that shit.
I mean, yeah, I put you majorly on the spot there with
it's
the
fun
question.
to talk about, but it's just like I end up just kind of in a hopeless position.
I think that's honestly the position that George is taking with the Battle of Blackwater, and I think I love how you feel in the Battle of Blackwater is not like, yeah, go Stannis, get in there. I mean, maybe some people are, but I don't think that's actually George's intent when he's writing the Battle of Blackwater. He's writing like, oh, actually, it would be kind of bad if Stannis took King's Landing. What's going to happen to the people in King's Landing if his army is coming in before Stannis can even arrive in the city itself? I mean, Stannis might be a generally just guy, so to speak, and is generally frowning upon rape and upon like the poor conduct of his soldiers, but that's still not going to stop a lot of his men from doing those very things that he's standing against in a battle scene, as we found out on the Wall. Because I mean, Stannis' men do commit rapes against the wildlings and things like that before, and his words and his example don't necessarily lend itself to good conduct of his soldiers. And I think like, no, I'm sorry, you got a point.
You're so right, but it's like then the problems become so much deeper and bigger to wrestle with than one army or one commander or one battle can solve. And it's just like, so if you think about the problem you just raised, like even if you want Stannis, even if you're cheering for him in the most possible way to take the city, him taking the city involves a horror show, and there's no real meaningful way to compensate the people for that, and there also probably wouldn't even be an attempt to compensate the people for that. So, and it's like to solve that problem, you would have to break down the fact that Stannis can command that many people, and the fact that the people in King's Landing don't have any other options, and like that, solving problems of that magnitude requires generations of work, even if you're not like, sitting back like Obama with his latest memoir to talk about your unique perspective on how the Titanic sinks. Even if you're not taking that kind of approach, like these are intractable problems that Stannis cannot be called upon reasonably to solve.
Right.
So that doesn't really get you anywhere either. It's totally correct. It's just useless, which I think ends up being a lot of this kind of conversation. You know what I mean?
I'm totally with you on that being like, it does feel useless, and you do feel, I think people feel, and I feel this way, I feel small, like when I come to like these battle scenes, both by the size of the scope of what's going on, but also just not just the battle itself, but extending it beyond like all the societal problems. Like ultimately the problems of the Battle of the Blackwater and why people are fighting is over feudalism, right? Who has the ability to lead the country? Is it by birth, by station, by the fact that one person is claiming to be Robert's heir? And does it actually make for a just set of principles of rulership and the reason why people should be fighting? Yes, maybe. I mean, Joffrey's obviously a monster, right? I mean, Hitler was obviously a monster, but does it actually solve like the long-term human condition of fighting these battles and these wars in order to sustain the feudalistic Westerosi society? Does fighting these long-term battles sustain our own system of government? These are questions that are beyond even me as Joffrey / Brendan B. Fish to really answer.
Yeah, I agree. That's why we talk about individual contact points. That's why we like to reduce history to clear contact points. And we're reading Fever Dream obviously at the same time, and those characters in Fever Dream feel a large historical forces kind of suddenly swirling into them, and it's terrifying, but it's also thrilling because it's like, I'm on the stage of world history, and things are happening through me. And maybe that sensation is itself the problem, because if you start thinking about, I think George wants us to. That's the thing, because like when we talk about these kind of things being ambiguous, that can seem very shallow in a way. Like, you just can't solve. Like you were saying earlier, it's just a mystery, whatever. Sometimes that can seem very glib and flippant, but I think George genuinely does want us to try and solve the problem of the Battle of Blackwater and realize we can't. if that makes sense.
Just as we can't solve humanity altogether. I think we'll probably human problems
Nailed it there, sir.
are beyond us as individuals. Yeah, unfortunately, till heaven or death do us part. Maybe we'll just save the stuff about the Battle of the Blackwater and what it means for the Winds and Winter for a later battle chapter. We got a bunch of these battle chapters.
That's true. Plenty of battles to come.
Yeah, plenty of stuff to chat about here. So I think that's going to wrap it up for this analysis on the Clash of Kings Sansa 5. I hope you all have enjoyed this. I think it's been a kick-ass episode. As always, please review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Podbean, Spotify, YouTube. Obviously, for those of you folks who are watching on our live streams, hit that thumbs up, subscribe, hit the alert button so that you know when we're actually going to be doing one of these live streams every single Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And yeah, do all that sort of stuff.
You can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/NotaCastASOIAF. You can follow us on Twitter at NotaCastASOIAF or shoot us an email at NotaCastASOIAF@gmail.com. You can find me at PoorQuentin on Twitter or at PoorQuentin.com.
And you can find me at Brendan Beefish on Twitter, Brendan Beefish on Reddit, and my website is warsandpoliticsofIceandfire.wordpress.com.
We want to shout out and thank our high lords and ladies on Patreon, Red Relu himself, who has renounced his allegiance to the Squishers, Lady of 1,000 Words, Septon Eastwood of Introvert Isle, Septon Merrybald, the Shoeless Sage, Sister Winter, Lady of the Wolfswood, Nessie the Elusive, Warden of the Neck, Defender of the North, and Keeper of Secrets, Sandy the Dragon, Blood of Queen Daenerys, and Lady of Jameson, Lady Brit, Bastard Mistress of Harrenhal, Sir Thomas the Raven Knight, Lord of Blackwood, Lady Dillsdale, the Star Spear of Crescent Hill, Sir Way, of course, Matt, Warden of the Sanguine Shore, Lord Sam K, Sir Michael Mertens, Wisdom Bendercott, Alchemist of Sets and Quanta, Maid of the Arts of Bull and de Morgan, Tibbs the Great of House Catnapping, Lord J. Manderley, Baker of the Frey Pies, Septon Merriful Head of Hair, Lady Silverwing, Joe Snow, King of the Metro North and Protector of the Tri-State, Kaboth the Unfrozen, Lord of the Bricks and Castle Crimson Light, Sir Keith of House Corbray, Wielder of Lady Forlorn, Lord Andrew, Warden of the Dubai Sands, Ryan Noy, Forger of the Mighty Hammer and Keeper of the King's Anvil, Lord Young of the Ghost Woods, Lady Mirror Reed, Wielder of Dark Sister, Slayer of Tinfoil, Lady of Rainy Afternoons, Sir Will of the Anarcho-Syndicalist Commune, Lord Clay, Sir Small Paul, Guardian of the Stonehaven, Defender of Dunatar Castle, Septon T-Bone, Refined Wrangler of Icy Arachnids, Lady Veronica, Caretaker at the End of the Crossroads, Lady Danielle of House Lannister, Titanium Pirate, Lady Carly, Lady Joan, who adds Lady Ranger of the Frostfangs to her title, and Lady Amy Blackfire, Analyzer of Chinese Literature and Dismantler of the Patriarchy. Thank you so much, as always, to our high lords and ladies.
Absolutely. Thank you all so very, very much. And love the new title, Joan. So join us next week for A Clash of Kings, Davos 3. You guessed it. Part 1, in which the fleet flying the banner of the Fire God gets blown apart by fire. No, that can't be right. Is that what happens?
That irony. That just can't be allowed to happen. Everything must be straight-laced and straightforward, and Stannis demands it.
Yeah, that's the way that Stannis demands it. That's the way it actually happens. Everything that Stannis wants happens in A Song of Ice and Fire.
Damn straight.
Does not. So thanks so much for listening. Thank you to all of you who are watching. And we will see you all next week for A Clash of Kings, Davos 3, Part 1.
Wonderful.
Right.
I always feel I say some very Englishman adjective whenever we're done. I would say wonderful or lovely or some other just something I should say with tea and the crumpet at the end.
Were you born in the wrong century? Or should you?
I was definitely born in the wrong century in the wrong continent. I was thinking to myself as I was saying this. This is a very sad thing to say, really, as I'm saying it out loud to myself. I should have been around with Proust. Ah, well.
Is it Proust or is it Proust? I always pronounce it as Proust. Is it Proust? I could be totally wrong.
I think it's supposed to be Proust, but who cares? He's dead. He wrote a 10,000 page book about cookies. He's allowed. We can call him whatever he wants.
Looks like everybody's going all in on this English stuff. We got Clint saying tip top.
Capital I old sport. Yeah, well.
And we got Guilty Undertaker saying smashing.
They don't do much right, but as a people, they have some very good adjectives. I love using rubbish as an adjective. Very smart. That's almost worth the whole empire thing.
If it wasn't for the whole taxing us without representation,
not even on the top 100 list of the British worst crimes, but sure, we'll go with that one. Really, very most uncouth.
Yes, most
unorthodox. It simply isn't done. Now we're just in Gilmore Girls territory.
Are you still watching Gilmore Girls? Is that what you're still watching?
Always watching Gilmore Girls. No, we've been watching Gossip Girl, which is
Oh, that's right. I forgot the wrong Girls show that you're watching. As long as it's not Girls, the HBO series, which I actually liked back in the day. Sorry.
I remember vaguely watching that. I would watch Gossip Girls and Gilmore Girls again first, though, before I would watch Lena Dunham. That's a whole different discussion.
By the way, Lauren is here. Shakespeare of Thrones. Good to see
you.
Hi.
Wonderful. How are we
Yes,
doing, everybody?
everyone seems to be really, really good and all amped up.
Clint
And
talking
Alicia,
about the Stamp Act. Clint would have been fun to hang out with as an undergrad.
I would have had so much fun with Clint. Yeah, I would have gotten super fucking wasted, and we would have been like arguing about back in my very libertarian days, and when as an undergrad, and when I'm less.
I can
that way.
imagine. I can imagine. It's a beautiful
It'd be
sight.
fun. You toss you in there as well. You know, if
Oh, God. I had
and
long
Frank,
hair
we gotta
still back then.
we gotta get Frank in there too, like the ultra conservative to kind of get into this. All right,
Ultra
question time.
conservative.
Alicia has been like begging to ask this
That's true.
question. I'm totally going to ignore you. No, I'm not kidding. I will. Alicia, not Alice, who actually is Alice, asks, "What do you think Melisandre would have done to supposedly turn the tide of the Blackwater?"
This is a very interesting question. We'll probably get into this also when we get to the explosion.
Yeah.
But I'm not convinced there's actually much she could have done because, okay, we see her in action as a battle mage in Storm of Swords, and it's cool, but she's blowing up one bird.
Yeah, she
That's
kills a
the
bird.
full extent of her powers. So, like, what? She's going to form like a large bubble of protection around the wild. I think maybe she could have had a plan to do something else that could have helped out in some other way, but I doubt she could have outwardly contained the wildfire explosion. And this is also, you have to weigh in, as we'll get into in Davos 3. There's something just very weird about that wildfire explosion, which is beautiful but never really explained, and that it seems to be kind of conscious. And I don't know how much there is Melisandre could have done about that.
Well, it's like George is like wanting us to like feel that the Blackwater is like a character, or excuse me, the Blackwater, that the wildfire is a character in the Battle of the Blackwater itself. Like,
yes,
magic itself is like a character in the series. It comes.
I love that. New York is a character in our show. Exactly.
Right. Exactly. So
yep.
It's so I really don't think there's that. I think it's honestly just something that Melisandre uses as like a rhetorical tool to be like, Stannis.
Exactly what I was
now
thinking.
You would have won the Battle of the Blackwater had I been there. But
so
since I wasn't there,
listen to me about everything now. Yeah.
Right.
She's guilting him. Yeah, I think
exactly. Right. She's guilting him, and she's also like being like using the fact that she wasn't there as a way to boost her rep, so to speak, to Stannis, and
with conveniently not having to do anything. Yeah, I think that is actually 100% in Melisandre's wheelhouse. I think that's totally right.
Yeah, but I just don't think Melisandre would have really. I mean, like killing that bird is really fucking metal when we come to that in a Storm of Swords. But it's just
it's great, but it's one.
One bird.
She's taken out Mance's whole army with fire springing from her fingertips or nothing.
Oh, and I love the fact that she's like, "Oh, what happened to the bird?" She's like, "Well, someone might have killed that bird. Just someone." Like she's really super proud of herself for killing that bird. Good job.
Congratulations.
Yeah. It wasn't just all of Stannis' knights.
You shot down one can off the fence there.
That's right. You're not even an ace. You got to go 5 birds before you can actually beat them.
Exactly. We'll talk. Take down all of Bran's birds, then we'll talk.
Good question. Subroy asks, a problem with the show Elio and Linda often mentioned with the show was that the atmosphere and texture wasn't its strong suit. How do you think this influenced Sansa?
I don't know if I necessarily agree with that criticism.
I don't think either.
I think there are moments when obviously the budget had its limitations, and I think obviously Dorne was kind of a train wreck in pretty much every respect, including I think the overall texture and atmosphere. But when I think of like the Blackwater episode, I think of tons of like just like the torchlight against fabric and stone and like the eerie colors, and so I think overall, I think maybe you could say that they kind of lost the tone of Sansa stuff in season 5. Sometimes like Winterfell looked a little like, I don't know, like overlit. There were times it was like a little garish, I felt like, but overall, no, I think something the show always had was atmosphere. I think that's what made it kind of easy at times to overlook what wasn't working about the show, was because it had some really strong atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, that was like the major criticism, right? Is that it was just like focused too much on like the shock and awe portion of it at the expense of like the storytelling. Like I think
sure. I mean, it's not like, it's not like Stanley Kubrick level, like meticulous atmosphere. Yeah. Like it's not like, it's not artistry level atmosphere, but I thought it was effective at getting mood across. I always thought Game of Thrones was good at that.
I think so too. And I think like my major problem with Sansa's later Game of Thrones arc was more along the storytelling lens, in that they wanted her to be like, to go from season 4 where she's in the Vale to immediately transition on into Winterfell. And now she's up there, and then she learns through the experience with Ramsay, but how, why? And then in season 6, season 7, season 8 of the show, she becomes like a major political player and starts to like make these major political moves and is organizing the castle in advance of the others and doing all these things, which she doesn't really have like the requisite, foundation to do so. And this is where George is different, because George took Sansa from King's Landing, where she does receive a fair amount of political education, miseducation, and learning what not to do, as I was talking about the episode proper, from Cersei and from the people that are around her, goes up to the Vale and learns how to actually like rule and do the things like the organization of a castle when it's under siege, as we see when the Lord's Declarant besieged the Eyrie in A Feast for Crows.
Mhm.
And she learns how to like manage finances and learns how to manage food supply, who you're giving food to and where you're buying food from, and all these different things as we're seeing in her Winds of Winter's sample chapter. That's really like the thing that I think is I feel strongest in Sansa's arc, is that later in the seasons, it doesn't feel as earned, like the way that she's like a major political player. Like I think like they knew that Sansa would become Queen of the North. Like that was pretty apparent from the end of the show, that George told them, yes, Sansa Stark will become the Queen of the North. She'll have her own separate independent kingdom from the Seven Kingdoms. But they didn't really know how to really get there and make it like really all that believable. So I think like a lot of the hollowness that people feel about Sansa in later seasons came as a direct result of not doing the hard thing that George did, which is to have Sansa have a long time learning at the feet of fuckface Littlefinger, and that really it made it for a lesser storytelling, I think, ultimately.
I agree. Although I think George is also running into trouble there just because he didn't age up Sansa. So she really hasn't had that. Like, I think her feast stuff is very valuable, but she hasn't had that much time really.
No.
At Littlefinger's feet. So I think George will have to plug the gaps in this regard, probably involving some stuff in the North. Which I think the show eventually got to. The problem I really, had with, not to rehash this, but the problem I had with season 5 is they were basically, it felt just like they were starting Sansa's story over.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, here you are again. The prisoner of a horrible psychopath who's in charge. Good luck. And it was just like, well, but this is valuable time you need to establish the missing link that you were just talking about to get us from Sansa at the end of season 4, where she's starting to take part, to get us to Sansa in season 7, where she's taking charge. Like, we need the space in there to be her learning, not resetting the clock. But obviously. That's well-tread territory.
We've been there. Oh. We're never ever going to leave like Game of Thrones territory. I mean, it is what we have right now for the conclusion of Sansa's arc. So whenever George releases the Winds of Winter, you expect it to be better, and hopefully it will be in actuality as well as in hope. Micah asks, if you were to attribute a different villain of A Song of Ice and Fire to a book in the series as their book, where they are centered, as protagonists, who would each get a book?
So each the antagonist for each book. Well, in book 1, obviously Cersei is set up pretty strongly as Ned's made villain, although you could definitely make the case that Littlefinger is actually the one being the antagonist of that book and driving things behind the scenes. I think we've talked about in Clash of Kings that Stannis is kind of structurally the antagonist because Tyrion's the protagonist. Mm-hmm. And it builds up to a combat between them, but really Joffrey, I think, is more kind of the center of evil. I think it's fair to say. Storm, I think, is the clearest antagonist. It's Tywin. Tywin commits the Red Wedding in that book and then dies at the end. So, yep. Feast, obviously, that's Euron's introduction, and he's my boy. But Feast, I think one of the things I like about Feast is kind of the villain's the protagonist. It's Cersei, even though she's a POV. And then, Dance has, as Ramsay set up, I think, pretty evilly in the North. But the East in Dance doesn't really have a central villain figure, which I think some people take as a weakness, but I think is kind of interesting.
Well, I think it's a yet question, right? I mean, I think
exactly. That's fair.
The Tattered Prince is going to fulfill that role in the Winds of Winter in the East. I mean, like all of these villains in the East in Dany's storyline, the Green Grace, Histar's Oloric, I guess, the Shave Bait. I mean, they're all like minor.
Sure. And there's the Harpy to be dealt with still if that reveal ever happens, but that might not even be a thing at all. So yeah, I agree. Tatters is going to emerge quite sinisterly, especially when you get to Pentos, which is probably where we'll end in Essos is Pentos. Yep. So that'll put the signature on it. I agree.
No, I absolutely agree. I think I don't have any disagreements with the villains of each of the books. I mean, you can make the case in A Storm of Swords that's Walder Frey as well, but I mean, he's operating under Tywin Lannister's orders. I mean, he's like the
sure.
I think Walder Frey, and I was because Steve Atwell is almost at the Race for the Iron Throne portion. He's right at the Red Wedding itself, the chapter right before he's the last. Is it Arya 8? I think from A Storm of Swords, Arya 7. Like Waterfrey is just so obnoxiously like evil in those portions that's just like, oh, this guy just sucks so bad. But it's ultimately it's Tywin who's running the show. So yeah, he definitely feels like the evil guy there. And I think Cersei in A Feast for Crows, Euron as well.
Lawrence says in the chat that the villain in Feast is just death. And yes, absolutely.
Yeah, well, it's called A Feast for Crows after all.
It's all just about
death. Sorry, we just watched the Charge of the Rohirrim.
Exactly. That's the best part for me.
Yeah, they're all shouting for death. Huh.
Yeah,
is Theon the good guy or the bad guy? I don't know. We'll talk. All good stuff. Let's see here. Frank B asks, for my Q&A, I would like to ask Jeff how he feels about the Ravens being in third place in the AFC North behind the 9-3 Browns. Thank you very much. I feel okay about it. I think the Ravens were never I will not get into the specifics here because I'm going to bore everyone else, but especially Emmett. But I will say that I think the Ravens are in a good place to make a strong playoff run towards the end. So I am sanguine about the fact that the Ravens are in third place right now, and I have a fair amount of hope that they're going to make the playoffs as one of the outside seeds, and I think they're going to make a strong playoff run going forward. And I think we saw their practice squad essentially almost beat the Pittsburgh Steelers, which it's a good sign of things to come as our stars come back from COVID protocols. Look at me being so magnanimous.
Very, very, very lovable. Very, very nice and diplomatic. Can I say how much I love that Frank wrote third and then in parentheses with the number?
That's government.
Just to make clear in case there was any confusion.
Right.
Who's in charge here?
Having written several government, memorandums in my time, you write the number, you write the word, and then you write the number there afterwards to make sure that no one's absolutely confused. Like 3 parentheses 3. And then, it's
important. Frank's just he's dotting the I and crossing the T's. It's just,
Yeah, I mean, he's
a lawyer out there in the world. He's got to be very, very, very on point.
Now that he's an official fucking lawyer, I guess he now has to write basically legal memorandums.
Lawyers on the business cards.
No, it's in all seriousness. Congratulations, Frank, for the Browns, I guess, but more importantly for, of course, getting your JD and of course passing the bar in Ohio State. So that's awesome, brother. So also all the best to you. All right. Oop, I just saw a question there. I just missed it. SKNCS, on a scale of 1 to 10, how glad are you that there's no 5-year gap that George R. R. Martin probably won't write some kind of rape thing between Sansa and Littlefinger?
Oh, that is confidence that I do not share. I don't think George wants to write a scene like that, but Littlefinger is not dying without making some attempt at Sansa. It's just not going to happen. I think it's going to be a lot less explicit than if she was older. But like George writes creepy sex scenes, guys. That doesn't necessarily mean George R. R. Martin is a creepy sex maniac. I'm sure you can make that case if you wanted to, but he has not discovered that he shouldn't write those scenes. Like A Dance with Dragons has some of the most out there of those scenes.
Yeah, the Tyrion scene.
They're coming. Yeah, or like the Asha Carl scene, which I love, but starts with rape roleplay.
Yep.
That was bold on George's part, and that's not going away in wins.
It's man, I'm there with you, man. Like I think it's gonna be. I think it might happen in the Winds of Winter. I mean, I hate to
he's gonna
say
try
that.
Something. He can't not.
I mean, who is Sansa's defense from Littlefinger, right? I mean,
Lothar Brune, who works for Littlefinger
in the employ of Littlefinger. Lothar Brune, who, by the way, I was rereading the final Sansa chapter. I think does he make his first appearance at the end of Clash of Kings as being one of the knights that is riding there?
Right.
But,
yeah. He what happens? He did well in the Blackwater.
He did well in the Blackwater, and I think he's granted knight. I might be misremembering because I only read it very briefly as I was going through these Sansa chapters. But yeah. I gotta say, folks, I think it might happen in the Winds of Winter. I think that I don't know if you all remember like season 5, but like when the Sansa rape scene happened with Ramsay, like there was just a massive outpouring of hatred for the show, and for good and valid reasons. I don't want to downplay what people are feeling about that scene, but one of the things I thought was not the best argument was like, this is never ever going to happen in the books.
Yeah,
similar to like Stannis will never ever burn Shireen Baratheon in the books. Sansa will never ever be raped in the books. You hope that's not the case, but I think like George has to write where the story takes him, and unfortunately, like Littlefinger's exhibiting a lot of characteristics of a fucking sexual predator to Sansa Stark, and at some point he's going to want to fulfill that fantasy of him and Catelyn with Sansa at some point, and I don't know. We'll see.
Well, it's I think it's a question of the medium. Of course, things are just different on screen with actors, but also it's just a question of tone. And there was just a bro-ishness to Game of Thrones that was just kind of very palpable at a certain point, and it had already become kind of a problem by season 5. But I think we should not react to that by acting as though George R.R. Martin writes tender stories. Like that's not the case, and we know that. Like the man's trying to write high fantasy Moby Dick. It's going to make us very uncomfortable. And that's just the reality. And that's easier on some people than others. And that's not for everyone. And I think we should have our eyes wide open going in. The problem with Game of Thrones, I think, is not that they filmed a bunch of sexual assault scenes. My problem was their attitude about it, both from within the show and how they talked about it.
And the aftermath too. The way it was brought up in season 8 was, I thought was, in my personal opinion, was distasteful, and how it was like Sansa's talking about how I learned so much from this, and you're like, no, that's yes. Well, we will deal with that, of course, when it comes out in the Winds Winter next week or the week beyond. Pedro asks, is Tywin a pure evil villain like Euron or the others?
Well, no, but I mean, Euron and the others is George having to invent, things. I think that's a perfectly fair, because I was like saying him earlier along with like the antagonist of each book. Now that's a perfectly fair question. I think Tywin has moral justifications he bothers to make to himself that someone like Euron doesn't. I think Tywin can convince other people of the morality of his actions in a way that Euron barely bothers to. And I think Tywin at some point was capable of love, if everything about Joanna is clear, but Tywin is just, it's just utterly anathema to him that there could ever be consequences for his actions, or he could ever have done anything wrong, or anyone is ever allowed to criticize him. And that just doesn't matter how, even if he started out much better than he is, that just mindset was going to lead him to doom. And he's also kind of a violent dude in general. So I think if you broke down his components, like, here's Tywin Lannister on paper. Obviously, he's not as bad as Euron. But, like, the Red Wedding is as bad as anything anyone like Ramsay or Gregor has ever done. And Tywin ordered that. So, I think it's those, are you your actions or are you your personality? It's that kind of question, right?
It is. I agree with that. Pure evil is such a, I think it's a loaded term, and I know that people kind of use it like, oh, this person is pure evil. Like Euron is not pure evil, or I mean, at least at some point, he probably did something that was nice or kind or something like that at some point, early stage in his development, I'm assuming. But he became this way, and Tywin also became this way too. And like you were saying, like Tywin justifies all of his actions, and like, it's better to serve, kill a dozen men at dinner than 1,000 men in battle. And you're like, well, it's a horseshit explanation, but I mean, he has reasons, and that Tyrion can't argue his way past them. Tywin is more like, instead of like Euron being like the supernatural evil, like Tywin is like it's similar to like to the type of evil we would encounter in a political leader. Sure. Today, so which makes him relatable. Yeah. I think is relatable the wrong word.
Or recognizable, maybe. I think that's because I think you're absolutely right that like with Euron is George like drawing from from Lovecraft and from horror and just from drug induced imaginings. Like Euron is not supposed to be a real human being. Euron is supposed to be something that happens to real human beings,
right? And
then they deal with it. Tywin is supposed to be someone that I think George is specifically thinking about the politicians behind the Vietnam War. I think probably more than anybody, but maybe also thinking about Yeah, about real world, feudal era nobles with their titles and their nice mutton chops and their paintings of swords and horses, like that image, that idea of who the nobleman of Europe was. I think Tywin is supposed to be George looking at that and saying, I see the appeal, but here's why that guy actually is just as much an asshole as obvious slither lips Ramsay Bolton over there. I think that's the catharsis of reaching the Feast for Crows, like his corpse is rotting. You go, oh, he really was just that. And that wouldn't have the same impact if he was always obviously a supervillain, but I think you are supposed to reach that realization. Like, oh, this guy never did good. Okay, this guy actually was the worst, wasn't he? I think you're supposed to gradually reach that point, if that makes sense.
No, that makes total sense to me. I absolutely agree. Alan asks, who is dumber, Balin or Victarion?
Well, what do you think, sir? That's a good question.
I mean, Balin invaded the North without a real plan. I mean, I think like the magnitude of his idiocy is elevated. So, I mean, like in terms of like results, I think that Balin is true. Balin.
But if Victarion had been in his position, he might have done the same.
Oh, he absolutely would have. Yeah, probably would have even been less of a plan. I mean, Victarion is not bright at all. And George makes a point of calling him, dumb as a stump, as he said. He explicitly said that in 2012 at a convention appearance. Him and Aaron Damphair, he said, we're both dumb as stumps. But I think Aaron has a little bit more to him than Victarion and Balin. Obviously,
I think Aaron just understands Euron a little bit more than Victarion does. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like when we call Victarion dumb, although he is, like, keep in mind we are comparing Victarion. His chapters are about him compared to Euron, and then him compared to Mercuro, and those are just very smart guys. So Victarion, he's not unusually unintelligent for an old way Ironborn guy.
Yeah,
like he's just bog standard for those guys. Like some of his sidekicks are unusually unintelligent for Ironborn. Like even Victarion makes fun of some of his own guys. Like you don't get what's going on here. Even Victarion sometimes understands the subtext, and some of his men don't. So I think George constantly pokes fun of Victarion within his own scenes, but I think he's just kind of average. Balin, I think they're roughly probably the same in terms of their outlook on the world. I think Balin just got his dander up about losing a war, and that made him grievous in a way that Victarion, like, he doesn't like it when Asha brings up that he lost Fair Isle, but Victarion says that thing like a man should lose a battle so he doesn't lose a war or something like that. And like Balin never seems to have gotten to even that level of wisdom. I don't know. I think Victarion might have a certain.
We can see smart when he's like commanding like the ships and stuff like that. Like he's
functional in a way that Balin is not. Like Balin doesn't even do anything anymore. So he is older. So I guess I think Victarion is more competent. I think they're probably equally unintelligent.
I agree. And like you were making a great point earlier that Victarion gets like surrounded by Euron, and then he's by Mercuro there afterwards, and then he's going to be in the presence of Barristan, which is going to be interesting, provided that Barristan survives. But he's also going to be around Tyrion Lannister too, provided that Victarion also survives the Battle of Fire. So I think like there are going to be lots of smart people and average people like Barristan that are going to be around Victarion. So, but you were making the point about that. But Balin, when he's making his war plans, he's got Victarion, Theon, Aaron Damphair, and Asha. And the smartest person there is Asha. And Asha is kind of like bought into being Balin's heir and doesn't really do a lot to like contradict what Daddy King is saying. So yeah, I think it's gonna be Balin, but I think equally they're equally bad. But yeah, Victarion does have a competence when he's on the seas, and his plan to get to Marine is sort of understandable.
I think oftentimes when we talk about intelligence, I think what we come down, what we're really talking about is curiosity and whether people are curious or not about learning. And Balin and Victarion just aren't. I mean, Victarion occasionally is. That's one of the things I like about Victarion's character is these moments when he's like, oh, another way of life? Nope, can't think about that. Nope, I have no empathy for that guy I just killed. No, not me. So like that, intelligence is not something I think is easy to define, but I think intellectual curiosity, I think, is maybe easier. And Balin and Victarion have zero of that.
Also, like Victarion just gets like owned all the time by like just regular people. Like when he's saying he's going to sail the Dothraki Sea, and he's like, "Where is it?" And people, and I think like people like to see this, be like, he's obviously unintelligent. And yes, George has said again that he's dumb as a stump. But if you're just getting like owned all the time, I don't necessarily know if that's actually like a sign of being dumb necessarily, as well as maybe being slow-witted, or I don't know.
Maybe just Tyrion just shouldn't be online. I think that Tyrion is that guy in Twitter threads who doesn't realize he's being made fun of. Like he still keeps coming back, like he's having we're going back and forth. Like, no, everyone else in the thread is making fun of you. That's what
you're not thinking of anyone in particular.
You're the main character of Twitter today, my friend. I'm not thinking of anyone in particular. But that's a Victorian who takes like a badge of pride. So yeah, like that's are those guys stupid? I mean, I don't know. I think they just it's not picking up on the signals. That's how I would describe it. Just not picking up.
Just not the radio tower is not an operation, so to speak. So
exactly. It's a satellite issue.
Agree. EIK asks, do you think that the Winds of Winter never coming out? Not true. And leaving no theory of indicator will result in a fandom divided by whatever ending they accept as canon, each group as separate schools of thought.
The Avignon Pope option. Yeah. I choose this. I choose violence.
Right. I don't know. I mean, listen, I think people have this idea that the Winds of Winter is going to be definitively tell you as to vindicate you or make you feel really bad about the things you believed in because they proved not to be true. And I mean, have you ever interacted with human beings before? Do people just subside and be like, actually, I was wrong. My theory was wrong.
We don't do that as a species. We're very much not into that. No, I mean, glibness aside, no, I think you're right. I think people wouldn't be satisfied in that exact way, even with TWOW. And, I think obviously I was talking about tone, and there can be many, many things different in the books and the show, but I do think the general overall character arcs of season 8 are going to be similar. And I think people are going to react negatively to that. So I think people are going to be unhappy no matter what happens. That's what we're saying. We get a book, we don't get a book. I think if we're waiting for us all to come together, I think that's never going to occur, which is fine.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think if we never get a book, I do imagine at some point, I think that George has enough notes and things that he's left, he has on file right now that will be bear itself out in the long term, and it'll be I don't know, maybe something similar to what Christopher Tolkien did with the Silmarillion and different things like that. So
sure, I think his notes will. I think if he can't come up with a book, I think his publishers will drag his notes out of him and try to squeeze money out of them. Yeah, I would bet that. Yeah,
agreed. Alan, who will be the POV when Stannis burns Shireen? Sansa, Bran, Jon, Theon, Davos, Asha, or Melisandre? And he says he admits he stole this question from the History of Westeros. I
saw that. Yeah, there was some great. Aziz has been doing some great, interesting discussions of questions over on his Twitter recently. It's great.
Yes.
What do you think, sir? You go ahead.
I think Melisandre. I mean, that seems to be the reason why she was introduced as a point of view character, because George realized that in order to show this event that he's been building up to, he's like, well, Jon's really not going to be involved in Stannis' storyline at some point. Sansa, Theon, all these people are going to be separated out from Stannis. But hey, I've got Melisandre, and she's going to be the part of that there. And I think the reason why it has to be Melisandre is because Melisandre has to be shown that her god has failed, so to speak. I think there has to be some sort of comeuppance in terms of her absolute belief in the power of her lore has to be shown to be false, and have her burn Shireen, or not her, because Stannis will be the one giving the order, but advising Stannis to do that and watching it happen. I think it has to be a moment for her of utter horror and realization that her god has failed her, and that she was not seeing the visions and the flames correctly all along.
Sure.
I think that honestly has to be from Melisandre's perspective. I don't think there's less emotional resonance from any other point of views that Alan offers here.
I agree. There's an actual arc there, whereas for anyone else watching, the arc is, no, you can't possibly be thinking of doing that, which I could certainly say that would be powerful, but it's not the same as a slow experience of Melisandre's start. Imagine, I feel like George would love to put the reader in Melisandre's mind as she is preparing to do this happily and force her to be in her brain. That would be just an intense writing experience, and I think something he would probably a project he would really enjoy. And yeah, I think Melisandre, is a POV in large part for this and to be there for Jon's resurrection. So I definitely think it's likely to be her. And And just, yeah, how George can, because also I think George has been keeping the Stannis Melisandre relationship off screen deliberately this whole time. And I do think that wall is going to break once.
Yes.
And that is Melisandre, either convincing Stannis or having already convinced Stannis to do this. I think that is when we're going to see that intimacy for the first and last time.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. That has to happen in this narrative fulfillment. I think that's what George is really good at doing as we're driving through a fever dream, and I think we're going to see the same for what happens with poor Shireen come probably the Winds of Winter. All right. Larissa says, "Hey guys, I just want to thank you again for helping me through my liver transplant recovery and let you know I went home last weekend." It's Lady Ivory Dane, who of course is one of our not a small counselors, and that's awesome. She sent us a series of really lovely messages on the Patreon messenger function, and it's great that you're back home. That's awesome, and then thanks for watching and thanks for supporting us, and that's great. It's
so glad.
Smile. Yeah,
all our best to you.
Absolutely. Was it someone said that my eyes are blue? My eyes are actually not blue, and Emmett is not. You're on. My eyes are green. I don't know if you can even see it if I look at the camera. Yeah, they're green. They're not blue. So, yeah, not a White Walker. Yeah. Alan, do you think there's a suspension of disbelief that the Red Wedding did not leak before it happened? How many soldiers, Freys, Boltons could know without risking someone speaking to someone else?
I think what do you think about that?
So there's a recent find by a friend of the podcast, but also one of my fellow moderators on the Song by Sunfire subreddit by the name of Zionias, who discovered that George had written a early version of Brienne's final Feast for Crows chapter, in which George had made it was significantly different than the published version of A Feast for Crows. And this was actually confirmed to be something that George had written. And the thing is that in that version, we get a line about how the Boltons had basically been pulling security for the Red Wedding. Like essentially it was volunteered that like Bruce Bolton basically moved his army out from the Twins proper itself and was then able to then collapse in on the Twins and kill all the Northmen outside. So I honestly think you probably didn't have to do any really like telling anyone anything until like the very end, until the point where they're actually like participating in the Red Wedding itself, because all of the people that are in the hall of the Twins, they're all like Freys and Boltons and people who are very much in on the plan and the plot. So does it beg or belief? Maybe a little bit, but I think like that George has an idea that maybe it doesn't necessarily do that. And we do see that, as we're going to come up to in Theon's final chapter, like the Boltons just like show up outside of Winterfell and just slaughter the men at Winterfell, all the Winterfell men outside the walls. And so there is that aspect that Roose and Ramsay's hold on the Boltons at least seems to be pretty resolute, and they don't flinch away from killing their own dudes on command.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up that one. That for me is the one that is requires more suspension of disbelief, that no one from the army escaped from Ramsay and got word to the Riverlands about what just happened there, that the Boltons were blatantly turning on the Starks and the other Northmen. Like there was a long time between when that happens and the Red Wedding that someone could have been warned.
Right.
And later in Dance with Dragon, we learned there were survivors from Sir Roderick's army because they joined Stannis. So where have those guys been this whole time? Mm-hmm. They knew the Boltons were traitors. So that requires suspension of disbelief. For me, the Red Wedding is actually pretty tight because they don't get there until right before it happens. So there's not much time for the armies to converge and intermix and, tell stories or hear gossip about each other. It's pretty solid in that regard. And like you say, yeah, like as Stannis says about the Karstark men in Theon's released Winds of Winter chapter, they weren't told, the soldiers. Why would they be?
Exactly.
They were going to be given an order minutes before it happened, and they would have followed it like they've been following these assholes their whole lives. Like, this isn't new. Like, the act itself is obviously more horrifying than ever, but if you're a random Frey soldier and Ryman Frey is like an inch from your sergeant's face telling him we're going to go kill those guys in 5 minutes, are you going to be the one Frey soldier who goes, no, that's against the rules?
No. Yeah.
You're going to pick up your spear and do it. So I think the Freys and Boltons were just counting on that. And then, yeah, the people in the room itself, the couple of dozen, ringleaders, they all knew. And I think there was no chance of any of them leaking because their necks were on the line.
I mean, it's like there's no like uniform code of military justice, which basically says like if you're given an unlawful order, like you're not supposed to obey said unlawful order. Like the aspects of feudalism means that you absolutely obey the orders given by the superiors above you without question. And if you don't, you're going to end up getting your ass killed, most likely by said betters. So, yeah, I mean, I guess it could beg your belief, but I do think it tends to work in the context. And really, here's the thing, like. You wouldn't really need a whole lot of like planning to be like, okay, you with the spear, go kill that guy over there. Like, do you actually need like a plan to do that?
Once you have the tents rigged to blow, that takes care of a lot of the work for you. And also, like, even if you're like a random Frey soldier and you want to blow the lid on the Red Wedding, how do you actually do that?
Mm-hmm.
Who do you go to? Who will you be permitted to speak to? Who can you get close to? Who will believe you? Who will take any of that seriously? Like, if I am a random Stark sergeant in Robb's employ, and a Frey soldier comes up to me and says, the hosts are planning to wipe out your king and his all men. My first thought is not going to be, I must warn King Robb. My first thought is going to be, this is probably not true, and I'm going to look like an idiot if I bring this up. So I think, is everyone staying silent realistic? Maybe, maybe not. But even if someone doesn't stay silent, how does word get through, and is it believed in time? I think probably not, especially since we're talking about pre-modern communication here. The guy would have to be in the room with Robb, and that's just not likely.
No, I mean, like, yeah. It's clear that the Walder Frey loyalists and the Bruce Bolton loyalists were in the room with Robb. So,
yep.
Yeah. Yep. SKSES, do you think the events of the past year will make George more or less likely to put grayscale stuff in the Winds of Winter?
Well, I mean, I've always vacillated on what grayscale's larger role, if anything, was to be anyway. I doubt he invents a whole new plot for it, but I bet the specific mood and imagery is going to be inspired. And I bet he knows that even if his grayscale stuff isn't inspired by COVID, we're all going to assume it is anyway.
Yeah.
I bet he's writing it with that in mind.
It's one of those things, like I always go back and forth on like you do. Because how much stuff can he possibly like fit into one freaking book? I mean, even if it's like the biggest book that's ever been written, like you're supposed to have a grayscale subplot in addition to all the other 18 point of view characters and all the different subplots and major plots and character arcs all going in. Like, I don't know. Like I still come back to this idea that grayscale is supposed to be for two characters mostly. I mean, three characters if you want to count Tyrion from A Dance with Dragons, but it's John Connington and Shireen Baratheon, I think is what it's supposed to apply most to.
Yep, so. I concur.
So I guess maybe that's just me saying I don't want to see that happen because I think it would be too much. But again, like I'm not the judge. I'm not writing the Winds of Winter. I know.
You heard it here first, folks. He promises it's not him.
Let's see here.
You want to take one or two more?
Yeah, I'm having a good time.
Sure.
Sorry asks, why are so many fan theories centered around Sansa's self-actualization by killing someone? Do you think it will happen?
Well, I mean, I think when you're reading a story about a person who has been put through very violent situations, I think it's natural to think that the next development of their story will about them being seizing control of the means of violence. And maybe they'll keep it up, maybe they'll put it down. I think that makes sense. I think it's easy to be too glib about Sansa seizing, being the person who's, passes the sentence and therefore everything is fine. I certainly don't think that's going to be how it goes. But I think it's maybe not best to think about self-actualization in the YA sense of the term. I don't think Sansa is going to have a clean moment like that where she fully becomes the person she's invested in and wants to be. I think that's going to be kind of more of a retrospective thing for her at the end. I do think taking down Littlefinger specifically is going to be a big part of her story, but I don't know if self-actualization is the character beat I would describe that as necessarily. Because I think there is something not bittersweet about it, but just kind of wretched about it in that Littlefinger is just gone and he already had a negative impact on Sansa's life and that's just not going to change. And I think that I don't think George has a flawless, perfect understanding of the damage that women face when they've gone through abuse, but I think Sansa's going to be dwelling on that more than I think self-actualization.
Yeah, I agree. I think hmm. Self-actualization is an interesting concept and idea, and I don't think that's what George is driving at with Sansa. Like, I understand like the question to be like that fans take a look at Sansa and they're like, yes,
Right.
her killing someone is going to self-actualize her, and you can understand that from those fans' perspective because I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been thinking about how a lot of the people that we tend to view as favorites in A Song of Ice and Fire, we tend to self-identify with, and I think like a lot of, and maybe I'm wrong about this, and people are welcome to correct me, but I think a lot of like women look at Sansa specifically and see someone who's been a victim of a vast amount of abuse by people in power, and they want to see that person stand up for themselves because they've had a similar experience in their own lives, and then they want to see that kind of want to see the fulfillment.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm trying to think of the best way. I'm trying to put it in a sensitive way, but also like speak to how I don't think that's necessarily what George is driving at. Is that looking at like his characters as like fulfilling
well, it's the universal versus the specific, right? Like obviously Sansa has parts of her life that resonate very deeply with people, but like she's still a fictional character, and the outcome of her life is still driven by specific events to her fictional world, and how she feels about it is specific to her, and it really ultimately has nothing to do with you. And that kind of bittersweet process is just, I think, the part just part of reading. And I think that same discourse ended up happening with Dany, where the part of it that resonates so deeply with you ends up feeling betrayed by other parts of her that don't feel as recognizable. And I think to desire an outcome for a character, there's nothing wrong with that. I think to feel as though this character didn't get this outcome, so therefore I can't, that kind of psychological implication, I think, is less useful or just less helpful.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No, that makes total sense. I mean, I don't think that George is necessarily writing fan service, so to speak, in order to fulfill what people want for the character. He's writing the character to fulfill roles that make sense within the confines of the character that he's written and the plot arcs that he's written and all the different ways that goes into writing in A Song of Ice and Fire. But it's great, man. I mean, I'm excited. I really came into this Sansa chapter being like really excited for Sansa's storyline. It's been a pleasant surprise for me, anyways, of coming into Sansa's story and reevaluating it from her perspective. And I mean, I highly appreciate what George is doing with her. Yeah, go ahead.
And Lauren's making some good points about like the little finger, or someone dying could be like the death of a past, something that Sansa's letting go. It's and it's just like you were trying to be sensitive a minute ago, and I appreciate that because it's hard not to say things like this without seeming glib. But it's like these just aren't instruction manuals.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? They're just not. Like, this is not just How to Live Your Life by George R. R. Martin, and it's never framed that way, and I think shouldn't be treated that way.
No, I absolutely agree. I think that is a sensitive way of putting it, I think. So I think it's a great way of engaging with that. But yeah, that's awesome. All right, let's take one more, and then we'll probably call it a night. You want to do Wins a Winner? I'll leave it up to you. Do you Wins a Winner, Threefold Revelations, or something else?
What's the something else? What do you got?
Oh, I gotta find something else.
Oh, sure. Well, let's go with Threefold Revelations then. Sure.
I got one from Alan about
like a mystery box.
Yeah. All right, let's do Threefolds.
Sure.
Oliver asks, what are some of your favorite examples of George's Threefold Revelations?
Well, that's very good. Well, I think the Stannis Shireen one, if it unfolds, with first with Renly and then with Edric Storm, I think is a perfect one of kind of ramping up of the Baratheon clan turning inward on itself. Let's see, what would be some other good ones off the top of my head? I'm having trouble.
I like Jon Arryn, like the reveal that Littlefinger and Lysa killed Jon Arryn, because I mean you get the reveal. Well, first of all, you find out that from early on that Lysa sends a letter saying that Jon Arryn was murdered, and you're like, oh my goodness. And then you find out, and you suspect that Cersei has done it, but then you like realize like, oh, actually, there's lots of evidence that that's not the case that Cersei has done, and so then you're left with this kind of like idea of like, okay, who actually killed Jon Arryn? And then you like completely forget about it. Like, we're not going to deal with like Jon Arryn's murder and death until like Sansa's final chapter in A Storm of Swords, right?
Sure.
I don't know if that's a threefold revelation necessarily, but I think that's one that stands out. I think the one that I think of the most that's more like resonant is the Stoneheart reveal, where you have Catelyn talking about her stony heart and talking about like becoming like a woman. Like the way that George foreshadows her becoming Stoneheart throughout Clash and
Sure.
but also in Game of Thrones too, before it's finally revealed as much. But yeah, it's cool to see George in action. I've always loved. I'm curious how it's gonna. I mean, I've got ideas for how R plus LHJ is going to play out in Revelation form, but we have a lot of like threefold revelation type things with. Jon being like, wow, Ned is very faithful to Catelyn. Why is there a bastard suddenly in the mix? And then you have like further stuff about Rhaegar and Lyanna, and then eventually we'll have the reveal about Jon's true parentage. I think it will be a good threefold reveal. So yeah.
I don't think it's always as literal as 3 direct steps, but it's the threefold revelation from his editor is the idea that you have a subtle hint, a blatant hint, and then the reveal. So something that only the rereaders could spot, something a clever first-time reader could spot, and then something that makes it clear.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely agree. Ah, man, what an episode. That was so much fun. All right, folks. Well, I think that is going to, we're going to can it for this evening. Again, we'll be back next week for Clash of Kings Davos 3 Part 1. I'm entirely sure we're going to like make the dividing line for that one yet. We got to jump into that chapter proper and get a little bit more in depth on it. But it's been a lot of fun chatting with you all and seeing so many friendly and familiar faces in the chat, and yeah, it's great. We enjoy doing these every single week with you all, and we look forward to doing this for forever and ever and ever.
Damn straight. Take care of yourselves, folks. Thanks for coming out, and see you next week.
Bye.